Before we dive into this whirlwind of bizarre traditions, ghost-proof staircases, and emotionally unstable spoons, do yourself a favor. Grab a snack, turn off your logic for a moment, and hit that subscribe button like you're swatting away a 17th century spirit. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around until the part where we explain why your grandma won't whistle indoors after sunset. Let's begin. Imagine believing that water could kill you, that the very act of washing your skin might open invisible gates through which sickness could slither in. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't a paranoid fantasy, it was common sense. People whispered that disease floated in the air, that it clung to the moisture, and that a bath wasn't an act of cleanliness, but an invitation for death itself. To scrub your body was to tempt the devil. It's almost poetic, in a twisted way, that people feared the one thing that could have saved them. Picture a nobleman in a grand stone manor, wrapped in layers of velvet and sweat. The smell alone could probably scare away an invading army. He hasn't bathed in months, maybe years, and he's proud of it. Why? Because he believes that the dirt sealing his pores is a kind of holy armor. Filth to him is not neglect, it's protection. He'll boast that water softens men, that it makes them fragile. Meanwhile, fleas dance a nightly festival on his skin. And yet, it wasn't madness. For centuries, science didn't exist as we know it. There were no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria. Disease was explained through theology and folklore. If someone got sick after a bath, it wasn't bacteria, it was punishment. It was God's way of saying, "Stay dirty, my child." Ironically, that divine instruction created generations of people who smelled like redemption but lived surrounded by death. The fear began after waves of plague swept through Europe. People noticed something strange. Those who frequented public baths often fell ill. The conclusion seemed obvious. Water spreads disease. In reality, it was the crowd, the rats, the filth, the shared towels, and the steaming tubs filled with reused water that did the job. But to a mind untrained in science, the pattern was clear enough. Water became the enemy. So families sealed their tubs, drained their wells, and kept dry cloths and strong perfumes. If you were born poor, your relationship with bathing was even bleaker. Rivers were polluted with animal carcasses, human waste, and dye from tanneries. You didn't cleanse your body there. You baptized yourself in infection. Many peasants took pride in the grit under their fingernails and the soot on their faces. It proved they worked hard, that they were strong, that they were not vain like the nobles who wore perfume to hide their sins. In a way, dirt became a moral statement. The clean ones were suspicious. The dirty ones were honest. And then there was the comedy of contradictions. People refused baths but prayed for healing. They rubbed themselves with dry cloths, wiped their faces with wine-soaked rags, and dabbed rose water on their necks while their feet festered in unwashed boots. It's as if they were saying, "We won't wash away the dirt, but we'll perfume it." You can almost imagine medieval towns filled with people who smelled like a battlefield mixed with a spice market. The church, ever watchful, added its own layer of guilt. Bathing was associated with vanity, and vanity with sin. To cleanse your body too often was to show pride. Some monks bathed only once or twice a year, and even then with great reluctance. Cleanliness might please the flesh, they said, but it endangered the soul. One chronicler even wrote that the pure in body are often foul in spirit. It's the kind of logic that makes you want to laugh and cry at the same time. How humans can turn something as simple as hygiene into a moral crisis. What's more tragic, perhaps, is how this fear shaped generations. Children grew up associating the smell of their parents, the sour, earthy stench of unwashed bodies, with safety. To them, that was home. The idea of submerging themselves in water was as unthinkable as walking into fire. And when someone dared to bathe, the neighbors would whisper that they were reckless or arrogant, tempting illness or lust. Imagine being so afraid of soap that you would rather die of infection than be seen as too clean. Of course, there were exceptions. A few curious minds, herbalists, healers, and early physicians, suspected that maybe, just maybe, the filth wasn't divine protection, but a curse of its own. They experimented with boiling water, with herbs, with oils, but in a world where most people thought disease came from sin, those who promoted cleanliness sounded almost blasphemous. They were mocked, even accused of witchcraft. If God wanted us clean, one priest reportedly said, he would have sent more rivers. Looking back, it's easy to judge them, to wonder how anyone could live surrounded by that level of grime and fear. But then again, we're not so different. Today, we have our own versions of irrational cleanliness and equally absurd fears. We spray chemicals on our skin, wash our hands until they burn, and still believe that perfection is just one product away. Maybe medieval people didn't have soap, but they had something we share, a desperate need to control what we don't understand, and that's what makes their fear so human. Beneath the dirt and superstition was a fragile attempt to survive in a world that constantly betrayed them. They didn't know why people got sick, so they made up rules, and those rules became rituals. Rituals that kept them alive, at least in their minds. But in the flickering candlelight of those dark centuries, one question lingered. If water could bring death, then what could truly cleanse the soul? Some would turn to prayer, others to blood, and a few to baths so vile they make even their filthiest fears look innocent. There's a strange intimacy in sharing bathwater with strangers. Or at least, that's what medieval people must have told themselves as they stripped down in smoky, echoing bathhouses, stepping one by one into a soup of sweat, skin flakes, oils, lice, and Lord knows what else. There was no such thing as private hygiene for most of society. Baths were collective rituals, part cleansing, part gossip session, part matchmaking, part bacterial exchange program. Imagine walking into a steamy room packed with naked bodies, and instead of thinking, "This is a terrible idea," people said, "What a lovely evening. No filters, no disinfectants, just tepid water slowly darkening with every new arrival. You're not soaking in a relaxing lavender bath. You're marinating in the grime of 15 other people who believe cleanliness is a social activity." And yet, these bathhouses were thriving hubs of community life. They were often built near taverns or markets, places where people already gathered. Inside, men and women would bathe together, sometimes segregated by time of day, sometimes not. Some cities enforced modesty hours, but enforcement was, let's say, flexible. There were rules, of course. Don't splash too much, don't hog the bench, try not to faint from the heat. But more often than not, things got slippery, literally and socially. Bath attendants would add herbs or oils to the water in hopes of masking the smell or preventing rashes, but all that really did was give the mixture a floral top note over a deeply unpleasant base. Think, old stew with a dash of rosemary. They believed that if it smelled nice, it must be clean, as if perfume could forgive bacteria. It's the medieval equivalent of spraying deodorant instead of showering, except now you're doing it in a room full of naked accountants, farmers, and bakers. And then there was the warmth of the water. Not from some advanced plumbing system, no. Bathhouses usually relied on large cauldrons of water heated over fires and dumped into the central tub. As the day progressed, no one replaced the water. They just topped it off, like a pot of eternal soup. You didn't get out because the water was dirty. You got out when your skin started pruning or when someone's pet chicken walked in. Yes, animals often wandered freely through public spaces. Nothing says rejuvenation like locking eyes with a goat while washing your armpits. What's even more fascinating is that despite how revolting this sounds now, these places were actually considered luxurious. Bathing was still a privilege. Heating that much water took labor and fuel. Only the wealthier towns could afford to maintain proper bathhouses. So peasants did what peasants always did. They improvised. A barrel, a bucket, a nearby stream. Or, in some cases, nothing at all. But even the fancy bathhouses didn't escape decay. As they became more popular, they also became more infamous. Eventually, many transformed into brothels. Bathing and sex became so intertwined in some cities that the church began cracking down, calling them dens of sin soaked in lust and sweat, which, frankly, might have been the most honest Yelp review of the Middle Ages. The decline of public bathhouses wasn't just about morality, it was also practical. When plagues rolled in, people started connecting the dots. Large gatherings of people in damp, enclosed spaces. Probably not ideal during a time when no one understood what germs were, but everyone knew people were dying. Some bathhouses closed temporarily, others permanently. Some doubled down and added more incense. If people are going to die, they reasoned, might as well die smelling like myrrh. Still, belief in the healing power of baths didn't die easily. People wanted to believe there was magic in the water. They began experimenting with new ingredients, wines, oils, and even animal blood, especially blood. There was a growing belief that soaking in the blood of a healthy beast could transfer its vitality to the sick. Calf's blood for the weak, goat's blood for fertility, and pig's blood for everything else. Some nobles even demanded tubs be filled with warm blood immediately after slaughter. Just imagine the logistics of that. Servants rushing from the barn to the bath with sloshing buckets of steaming red liquid. Meanwhile, the patient lounges there, hoping to absorb the essence of a squealing pig. It was grotesque and expensive, a display of wealth and desperation. No one really knew if it worked, but then again, no one really knew what did work. And somehow, that made everything seem possible. A mother watching her child waste away might try anything. If blood might save them, then blood it would be. Even if it meant covering their skin in something that smelled like a butcher shop on a summer afternoon. There were, of course, side effects. Not just the smell or the horror of it, but real health risks, infections, fever, rashes. But again, any reaction was seen as a sign that the ritual was working. If you developed a rash, it meant the poison was being pushed out. If you fainted, it meant your soul had loosened and was being purified. There's something tragically funny about that. The worse the result, the more successful the treatment seemed. That's not medicine. That's medieval gaslighting. Even the herbs used in baths, those calming scents we associate with spas today, were chosen less for their properties and more for their symbolism. Lavender for purity, rosemary for memory, thyme for courage. They weren't cleaning you. They were cleansing your reputation. A spiritual shield, not a hygienic one. And yet, people swore by them. They bathed in broths so pungent they could knock out a horse and claim to feel reborn. Maybe they were right, in a way. Maybe belief was stronger than bacteria, or maybe everyone just had really bad noses. Still, the belief persisted that water mixed with the right substance, be it herb, wine, or blood, could restore balance to a body thrown into chaos. That philosophy, while primitive, isn't entirely alien to us. We sip detox teas, pour essential oils into diffusers, and spend hundreds on bath bombs that promise tranquility. We're not so different. We've just replaced pig's blood with pink Himalayan salt. But perhaps the most revealing thing about these rituals isn't the ingredients or the outcomes. It's the desperation. In a world without certainty, without science, people clung to rituals like lifelines. They needed to believe there was a way to reset the body, to remove the evil they couldn't see but felt deep in their bones. The bath became a sacred space, not because it cleaned them, but because it gave them hope, even if the hope smelled like wet goat. It's strange how confidently people can hold onto ideas that make absolutely no sense. Take medieval cleansing rituals, for example. You'd think that after enough plagues, skin infections, and unexplainable deaths, someone would raise their hand and say, hey, maybe rubbing ourselves with ashes and animal fat isn't cutting it? But no. Instead, they doubled down, adding even more flair to their already questionable hygiene practices. There was a particular fascination with herbs, not for their cleaning properties. God forbid someone use lavender for actual sanitation, but for their symbolic power. You didn't bathe to get clean. You bathed to be seen as spiritually intact, morally balanced, and socially presentable. A noble woman might soak in a mix of elderflower, wormwood, and crushed marigold, not to remove filth, but to enhance her aura. Not that her auras could mask the smell of month-old sweat trapped beneath 6 layers of velvet. These baths often took place in barrels or shallow wooden tubs. Water was a luxury, so it was barely enough to cover the legs. People would sit awkwardly in the lukewarm mix, gently splashing their torsos with handfuls of herb-steeped liquid while servants poured more fragrant infusions over their heads. But here's the kicker. The actual dirt? It stayed right where it was, because there was rarely any scrubbing. Soap, if used at all, was made of rendered fat and lye and could strip paint off a wall. Naturally, people avoided it unless absolutely necessary, usually after an encounter with a skunk or moral crisis. And yet, there was pride in these rituals. They were elaborate, time-consuming, and performed with the kind of gravitas you'd expect from a royal coronation. It's hard not to laugh when imagining a knight, fresh from battle, sitting in a bucket of tepid thyme water while someone chants blessings over his armor in the next room. But for them, this was sacred. The herbs carried power, the water carried intention, and the combination was supposed to align their inner and outer worlds. Of course, there was also the small issue of hygiene failure. These herbs weren't cleaning anything. At best, they added scent. At worst, they caused rashes or allergic reactions. But again, discomfort was seen as a sign of effectiveness. If it stung, it must be working. The logic was medieval skincare's greatest strength and its most painful downfall. You didn't want comfort. You wanted proof that the evil was being burned away. And so the belief spread that sickness was something you had to draw out. You had to lure it from your pores, tempt it with warmth, confuse it with sage, and then drown it in rosemary. If it fought back, say, with boils or a fever, it meant the battle was underway. This wasn't cleansing. This was spiritual warfare conducted from the privacy of a half-filled bathtub. But when herbs didn't deliver enough drama, people turned to more exotic additions. Urine, for example. Human urine. Fresh, if possible. It was considered sterile, medicinal, and even holy under the right circumstances. Barbers and surgeons used it to clean wounds. Women used it as a facial rinse. And for those who truly believed, it became part of their bathing ritual. Just a splash here and there. Maybe a rinse. Maybe a soak. Depends on your level of commitment. It's one of those moments in history where you think, no way. And then you read the records and realize, oh yes, they absolutely meant that. The obsession with bodily fluids didn't end there. Saliva had its moment. Blood, as we've seen, was already in the game. Sweat, too, was believed to carry toxins out of the body, which led to one of the most ironic behaviors of all, people avoiding water, but embracing sweat. They believed that sweating was the body's natural way of purging illness, so they wrapped themselves in wool, sat by fires, or even buried themselves in hot sand to induce the healing process. Imagine refusing to take a bath, but willingly roasting yourself like a turkey just to feel your forehead drip. And if someone fainted from overheating, that was just the demon leaving the body. Or consciousness. Same thing. These beliefs even extended into childbirth. Women were given post-birth baths infused with a wild cocktail of herbs, wines, and sometimes blood from a sacrificed animal, all intended to seal the body. The bath wasn't just a matter of care, it was ritual. One midwife might say, add lavender for calm. Another might add foxglove to ward off evil spirits. And still another might suggest a string of garlic cloves tied around the baby's neck, just in case. Hygiene, at this point, was a distant cousin nobody invited to the party. And speaking of parties, bath feasts were a thing. For the wealthiest, bathing became an event. Servants prepared scented waters. Musicians played lutes, and trays of roasted meats and spiced wines were brought in. Yes, they ate while bathing. Because what's more luxurious than dunking greasy fingers into a pheasant while sitting in a bath scented with decaying roses and goat milk? Etiquette books from the era even describe proper bath table manners. For instance, do not let your meat fall into the water, for this offends both guests and spirits. Practical and spiritual advice, all in one sentence. Still, not everyone could afford the luxury of confusion. For the poor, hygiene rituals were reduced to what could be gathered or begged. A handful of nettle, a basin of cold water, and maybe, if luck smiled, a piece of harsh soap left over from someone else's washing. Children were rarely bathed unless preparing for church or death. And since the average child in a peasant family ran through manure-filled streets barefoot, the results were predictable. But again, the dirt wasn't seen as dangerous. It was simply a fact of life, something to live with, something to die with. There's something deeply human in all of this. A desperate need to make sense of the body, of sickness, of suffering. These rituals weren't just about the physical, they were about control. When death comes without warning, when children die in their sleep, when boils rise for no reason and breath becomes short in spring, what else can you do but light a candle, draw a bath, add some herbs, and hope that somewhere in the steam, the sickness lets go? And as strange as it sounds now, we do the same. We light eucalyptus candles and soak in colored salts, whispering our worries to the water like prayers. We rub things on our skin because someone on the internet swore it worked. We sit in saunas hoping to sweat out the stress of a world that moves too fast. We're cleaner now, yes, but deep down, the ritual remains. They say your home is your sanctuary, but for most people in the Middle Ages, it was more like a cramped, smoky box of damp walls and permanent odors. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford, and hygiene, real intentional hygiene, was more of an accidental byproduct than a priority. Bathing at home? Unlikely. Washing daily? Unthinkable. Most people never saw a bathtub in their entire lives. Instead, they relied on something far more convenient and far less effective, the cloth wipe down. It was the medieval version of a quick refresh. A linen rag dipped in lukewarm water, maybe with a few crushed herbs if you were fancy, and rubbed across the face, hands, armpits, and, well, let's be honest, most people stopped at the armpits. The idea wasn't to be clean, it was to be presentable, or at least not horrifying. And since water was cold, scarce, and usually shared with everyone in the house, including animals, it wasn't exactly inviting. That's where the obsession with scents came in. If you couldn't remove the filth, at least you could cover it. People stuffed lavender in their sleeves, tied rosemary into their belts, and rubbed scented oils behind their ears. They didn't bathe for cleanliness. They bathed in perfume for camouflage. It was less about feeling fresh and more about not being publicly shamed for smelling like fermented onions, which, let's face it, was the baseline for many. Perfumes were serious business. They were made from everything from rose petals to ambergris. Yes, that's the waxy substance from whale intestines, and were so strong they could knock out a cow. Nobles carried pomanders, small metal spheres filled with fragrant herbs or spices that they'd wave in front of their noses when passing through less aromatic areas, which was, frankly, anywhere outside their castle. They might have believed in divine right, but not even royalty could hold their breath forever. It's no surprise that with all this masking, the line between health and decay got blurry. People didn't associate cleanliness with the absence of smell. They associated health with strong smells. If someone reeked of garlic and vinegar, they were probably well protected. It was believed that bad smells could fight off worse ones. This was the logic. Surround yourself with powerful nose-burning odors to ward off the invisible evils floating through the air. It was the Middle Ages version of fight fire, but with stench. This led to the widespread use of vinegar as both a cleaning agent and personal defense system. People would douse rags in vinegar and tie them around their necks or wrists, convinced it created a barrier against illness. Physicians, those brave souls who believed bleeding was the cure to everything, even advised patients to sniff vinegar-soaked cloth during plagues. It didn't save lives, but it certainly cleared sinuses. And when vinegar wasn't enough, people turned to smoke. Burning herbs like sage, juniper, and frankincense was believed to purify the air. Homes were regularly smoked out, not just to remove spirits, but to make breathing a little more tolerable. Picture a one-room hut filled with 5 people, a goat, a fire pit, and the thick, choking smoke of burning thyme. It wasn't so much a cleansing ritual as a form of accidental barbecue. Still, with all these efforts, there was one thing most people feared more than dirt: water. The belief that water could open the body to disease persisted for centuries. Many people thought that washing too often weakened the immune system, made the skin too porous, or exposed the inner body to evil humors. Ironically, avoiding water made them far more susceptible to infections. But who needs science when you have tradition and a deep distrust of plumbing? There's a strange comfort in the idea that doing less made you safer. In a world filled with uncertainty, Choosing inaction felt like control. Don't wash too much, don't air out your linens, don't let fresh air in. Keep the windows shut, the smells inside, and the diseases out. At least that was the plan. It's not unlike modern folks who won't go outside without 5 layers of SPF 100 and a full horoscope reading. We still look for patterns in chaos. The difference is, they did it while sitting on straw mattresses, soaked in decades of family history, literally. Clothing, too, played a role in this hygiene dance. Many people believed that simply changing clothes counted as washing. If you removed a dirty tunic and put on a slightly less dirty one, congratulations, you were clean. There are recorded accounts of nobles who owned dozens of tunics and rotated them instead of bathing. The logic was that filth attached to fabric, so by shedding the garment, you shed the grime. Never mind what remained on the skin. Out of sight, out of smell. Linens, of course, absorbed everything. Sweat, oil, fleas, lice. But they were hard to wash, and even harder to dry in wet climates, so they were beaten with sticks, hung out to air, and perfumed with rosewater. The bedding rarely got washed, and when it did, it was usually a sign of illness or death. If your sheets were being boiled, someone in the house had either died or was about to. This created an odd kind of hygiene theater, an illusion of cleanliness maintained through gestures, rituals, and scented distractions. People weren't clean, but they felt like they were doing something. And sometimes, feeling clean was all that mattered. It's not so different from someone today wiping their phone screen and calling it disinfected. Ritual trumps logic. Always has. The more you look at it, the clearer it becomes that medieval hygiene wasn't about health. It was about survival through symbolism. Every herb, every cloth, every scent was a talisman against a world that didn't make sense. And when those failed, people turned to the next best solution: sweat. Sweating was believed to be the body's natural way of purging disease. If you could heat yourself enough, through fire, fever, or effort, you could force the illness out. Saunas didn't exist in most of medieval Europe, but people made do. They bundled themselves in layers, sat by the hearth, or even wrapped their heads in steaming cloths. The goal wasn't comfort. The goal was purification through suffering. They even used hot sand pits. People would dig shallow beds into sun-warmed earth and bury themselves up to the neck, hoping the heat would draw out poison. Some laid in manure piles, believing the warmth and fumes had healing power. Again, no science. Just a deeply rooted belief that if something felt terrible, it must be good for you. It's a logic that survives to this day. Think about it. Hot yoga, juice cleanses, extreme fasting. We still associate discomfort with virtue. No pain, no gain. Didn't start at the gym. It started in a dirt floor cottage with someone rubbing salt on a wound and calling it progress. And through all of this, one question lingered, echoing through every room, every bathhouse, every herbal concoction and perfumed rag. If water couldn't be trusted, if soap was suspicious, and if dirt was protection, then what could save you? Somewhere between fear and faith, between stench and symbolism, there was a shift, a quiet, muddy turning point where the ritual of bathing began to collide with the creeping whispers of change. Not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly, like a damp wooden beam bending under centuries of filth and finally giving in. It didn't come from the kings or the priests or the physicians. It came, as revolutions often do, from desperation. By the late Middle Ages, the illusion that dirt could protect you had begun to crack. Plagues had swept across cities like whispers of divine punishment, wiping out entire populations. The dead outnumbered the living. And, for once, people began to question whether filth was really a holy shield or just a really bad strategy. You can tell a superstition is weakening when people stop defending it with passion and start muttering, maybe it's not working. It's a tale as old as time. Denial gives way to doubt, and doubt quietly opens the door to reform. The door opened wider when foreign cultures entered the frame. Through crusades, trade, and travel, Europeans began to see how others lived. And what they saw shocked them, clean people, especially in the Islamic world where regular bathing was not only common but expected. Public bathhouses were grand, organized, and often cleaner than European churches. Water was respected, managed, and above all, used. And not just for ritual, it was for health, for beauty, for sanity. To the average European returning home after seeing this, stepping back into a world of vinegar rags and garlic necklaces must have felt like crawling into a moldy sock. But habits are stubborn things, and change doesn't happen just because someone sees a better way. It happens when people get fed up enough to try something new, even if they're not sure why. It starts in whispers. Did you hear that bathing didn't kill him? I met a woman who bathes twice a week and she's still alive. There's this doctor in Florence who says washing your hands can stop illness. Small steps, quiet ones. A servant boiling water in secret. A mother washing her child more than once a season. A merchant wiping his hands before eating, not after. These were the beginnings of something radical, though no one called it that at the time. It was just common sense trying to crawl its way out from under centuries of scented nonsense. And as water slowly regained its rightful place, soap began its rise from the ashes, literally. Early soap was a crude mix of ash, fat, and lye, but it worked. It stripped the skin, yes, but it also stripped the smell. And in a time where smell was currency, this mattered. Cities like Marseille and Aleppo began to develop higher quality soaps, and these eventually made their way into the hands of nobility, then clergy, and finally, the slowly curious middle class. Of course, using soap was still an act of rebellion in many places. The church hadn't exactly changed its stance overnight. Too much cleanliness still hinted at vanity, and vanity was just pride in a better outfit. But there were fewer sermons condemning soap and more whispers admiring its effects. The man who smelled like herbs and not livestock, he was suddenly interesting, suspiciously attractive. The woman whose hands didn't feel like sandpaper, people noticed. Fashion played its part too. Lighter fabrics became popular, and lighter fabrics don't hide grime. You can get away with years of filth in a wool cloak, but linen? Linen tells the truth. And so, slowly, vanity began to fight back. Not through sin, but through silk. People wanted to look better, which meant they had to smell better, which meant they had to at least pretend to wash. Progress, one insecure noble at a time. Architecture helped. As homes became sturdier and more permanent, they allowed for more private spaces. Small washrooms, separate from kitchens, began to appear. Not full bathrooms, not yet, but alcoves, corners, areas with basins and cloths and the whisper of intention. You could clean yourself without public shame or theatrical ritual, and for the first time, privacy met hygiene. It was awkward at first, like a blind date between two strangers who had only heard terrible things about each other, but over time, they learned to get along. Even literature began to shift. Texts appeared, discussing cleanliness not as a moral failing, but as a virtue. Physicians, emboldened by empirical observation and rudimentary experimentation, started connecting dirty wounds to infected ones, contaminated food to disease. They began to advise patients to wash, not symbolically, but thoroughly. Not once a year, but regularly. They were mocked at first, but the thing about being right is that time eventually proves your point, usually after everyone who ignored you is dead. And just as science began to peek its head out from behind the curtains, plumbing came knocking. Early rudimentary systems evolved into more complex aqueducts and drainage structures. Cities began to think about waste management, not always effectively, but at least intentionally. Water flowed, however clumsily, into homes. Not many, not often, but enough to suggest that the world was tilting. Still, none of this happened smoothly. For every physician advocating hand washing, there were 10 priests preaching about the dangers of temptation through cleanliness. For every mother scrubbing her child with soap, there was a neighbor whispering that she was inviting spirits into her house. Culture clings tightly to its myths, and cleanliness had long been wrapped in fear. But step by step, the myths began to unravel. The irony, of course, is that what began as rebellion eventually became routine. By the time the Enlightenment rolled in, cleanliness had transformed from a suspicious act of vanity into a sign of virtue, discipline, even patriotism. To be clean was to be modern. To bathe was to be civilized. And somewhere along the line, people stopped seeing hygiene as something you do to yourself and started seeing it as something you owe to others. A civic duty, not just a personal comfort. It's a strange journey when you think about it. From shared tubs of filth to private baths filled with rose petals and steam. From vinegar rags and garlic necklaces to hot showers and herbal shampoo. From bathing in public shame to bathing in self-care. We laugh at the past, but we're standing on its shoulders. Muddy, fragrant, awkward shoulders. They did the best they could with what they had. And in between the herbs and blood and superstition, they laid the foundation for every clean hand, fresh sheet, and hot bath we take for granted today. So the next time you step into your shower, crank the knob and let the warm water wash over you, take a moment to be grateful, not just for the plumbing or the soap, but for the thousands of people who fumbled through centuries of bad ideas so you could stand there, clean, comfortable, and not soaking in goat blood. That's progress, even if it smells like eucalyptus. Sometimes, change begins not with a revolution, but with a sigh. A tired, defeated sigh from someone who simply can't stand the smell anymore. That's how many hygiene reforms truly started. Not because of grand ideals or scientific breakthroughs, but because someone, somewhere, reached their limit. You can imagine it. A nobleman leaning back in his grand wooden chair, surrounded by velvet curtains and gilded tapestries, breathing in his own fermented aura and muttering, "Perhaps, just perhaps, water isn't the enemy." By the 17th century, the absurdity of old rituals began to peel away like the grime on a long neglected floor. New philosophies were on the rise. Rationalism, observation, the very idea that maybe the universe didn't run entirely on curses and ghost breath. Doctors were starting to pay attention to outcomes, not just appearances. Some even suggested washing before surgery instead of just after. A radical idea, really. Clean the wound before cutting it open. A few centuries late, but we'll take what we can get. With each passing decade, the walls of superstition cracked a little more. Not shattered, Let's not give the Enlightenment too much credit, but certainly dented. People began to question why entire cities should smell like a cheese cellar during a heat wave. Cleanliness became fashionable. Royal courts set the tone. If the king bathed, so did his entourage. And if the queen wore lemon-scented gloves, then suddenly everyone wanted to reek of citrus and status. France, for example, went from being a nation that proudly avoided water to one that desperately tried to pretend it didn't. There's a reason perfumes flourished in Paris. They weren't just for elegance, they were survival tools. Versailles might have sparkled with chandeliers and powdered wigs, but the stench beneath those silks was legendary. Perfume wasn't a flourish, it was armor. And yet, within this growing obsession with fragrance, a new kind of ritual emerged, one that didn't just mask the filth, but suggested, tentatively, that maybe removing it was better. The idea of bathing for pleasure, and not just repentance or survival, began to spread. Of course, it was still reserved for the wealthy. The poor had to make do with cold rivers, rainwater, or the occasional stolen bucket, but the aspiration was born. To bathe was to rise above. Soap making became an art. Aleppo soap from the Levant, olive oil rich and delicately scented, made its way into European homes. Castile soap from Spain became a favorite among royals, and Marseille, once known for little more than fish and fleas, rose to international fame through its creamy white bars. Each region developed its own recipe, and for the first time, people started choosing soap the way we choose wine, by origin, scent, and lather quality. This shift brought with it something more powerful than cleanliness: vanity. People wanted to feel good, not just avoid death. Skincare was born. Baths became rituals of beauty and wellness, and for the first time in a very long time, hygiene began to carry joy instead of fear. The tub became a place not of punishment or disease, but of escape. But just as things were getting better, the Industrial Revolution showed up like an unexpected in-law with a suitcase full of smog. Cities exploded in size. Population swelled, and with them came filth on a scale previously unimaginable. Factory waste flowed through rivers, soot-blanketed streets, and human waste, well, let's just say chamber pots had their limits. You might bathe on Sunday, but by Monday morning the city would undo all your progress. Cleanliness became a weekly miracle at best. Still, infrastructure began to evolve. Indoor plumbing, once a fantasy, became reality for the upper classes. Water could now flow into homes, and waste could, ideally, flow out. The first toilets appeared, clumsy and loud and likely haunted, but functional. Soap became more affordable. And bathing, regular bathing, began to creep into the middle-class norm. And with this newfound access came a moral shift. Cleanliness wasn't just health, it was virtue. A clean child was a good child. A clean home was a moral home. Governments and religious institutions latched onto hygiene as a tool for order. Schools taught it, churches preached it, social reformers demanded it. The phrase, cleanliness is next to godliness, wasn't just cute anymore, it was policy. Public bathhouses reemerged, but this time with less sin and more soap. In cities like London, New York, and Berlin, community bathing centers opened for workers who still couldn't afford plumbing. They weren't luxurious, more like tiled factories of steam and scrubbing, but they offered something new: dignity. You walked out not perfumed, but truly clean. For some, it was the only moment in the week that felt human. But even as modernity marched forward, not everyone joined in. Rural areas remained skeptical. Old beliefs held on like mildew in a forgotten cellar. Some still feared water on the chest could cause pneumonia. Others thought washing hair too often would lead to madness. And of course, there was always the classic, if I wash too much, I'll wash away the natural oils. A timeless excuse that somehow survived multiple plagues and centuries of science. Advertising played its own twisted part. As soap companies boomed, so did the guilt. You weren't just buying cleanliness, you were buying self-worth. Ads warned women that bad breath could ruin a marriage, that unshaven legs were a sin, and that body odor was an unforgivable social crime. Then we're told that sweat equaled failure. Hygiene had gone from a medical concern to a moral performance. But for all its flaws, the push toward cleanliness brought undeniable benefits. Life expectancy rose. Disease rates dropped. Children survived infancy. And for the first time, humans didn't smell like they were in a permanent battle with decomposition. Bathing became a daily ritual, then a twice-daily one. Hot water became expected. Towels became soft. And somewhere along the way, we forgot how strange all this was. Because when you zoom out, it's kind of hilarious. Our ancestors feared water like it was a cursed relic. They bathed in blood, vinegar, and superstition. They prayed that scent would save them while fleas danced in their wigs. And now here we are, arguing over whether coconut oil is better than jojoba, whether 2 showers a day is too much, and if our loofah needs replacing. It does. If you're asking, it's probably time. That's the beauty of history. It doesn't move in straight lines. It stumbles, trips, and occasionally plunges face first into a filthy basin. But each time it rises, smelling slightly better. So the next time you're standing under a stream of hot water, listening to your favorite playlist, scrubbing away the day with a soap that smells like alpine meadow breeze, just remember, You're living a dream your ancestors couldn't even imagine. And they would have thought your shampoo was witchcraft, which, to be honest, it kind of is. It's almost poetic how, after centuries of avoiding water like it was a vengeful spirit, people eventually began to chase it like a long-lost lover. But it wasn't just a change in plumbing or soap quality that sparked this shift. It was something deeper, emotional, symbolic, even spiritual. Somewhere along the way, bathing stopped being about warding off death and started becoming a way to feel alive. As personal hygiene crept into mainstream culture, people didn't just adapt to it, they romanticized it. Baths became rituals, not the medieval kind with blood and goats, but soft, candlelit sanctuaries of steam and self-reflection. The bathroom transformed from a place of necessity to a personal temple. And with that change, something curious happened. People began to discover silence. It turns out that when you close the door, shut off the noise of the world, and let warm water run over your skin, something inside you settles. It's not just your pores opening, it's your guard dropping. You're alone, but in the best way possible. And in that quiet space, you start thinking about things you didn't even realize were bothering you, like that email you forgot to answer, or that weird thing you said 7 years ago. Showers became therapy with better acoustics. This emotional connection to bathing was no accident. As societies grew noisier, faster, and more chaotic, the bath became a rare moment of pause. In a world obsessed with doing, washing became an act of simply being. It was no longer about survival or social pressure. It was about reclaiming control in a life full of interruptions. And what's more ironic than that? The very thing people once feared for its ability to let things in became the place where they finally let things out. Of course, marketing caught on. Suddenly, bathing wasn't just a hygiene routine, it was a lifestyle. Products promised more than cleanliness. They promised peace. Lavender claimed to erase anxiety. Eucalyptus promised to clear more than your sinuses. It would clear your soul. Bath bombs exploded with glitter and ambition. Scrubs exfoliated both skin and self-doubt. There was a product for every problem, and if it didn't fix you, at least it smelled amazing. We didn't just bathe to clean ourselves, we bathed to rebrand ourselves. A fresh start in a ceramic basin, a new version of you, rinsed of yesterday's mess. And maybe that's why people began spending so much time in the bathroom. Some of us took showers longer than medieval people lived. You start with a quick rinse, then remember that argument you had in 2009, then rehearse what you should have said, then contemplate your purpose, then finally turn off the water and realize you forgot to wash your feet. These little inner monologues became part of the ritual. Water has a way of inviting memory. It nudges you gently toward reflection. It wraps around your body and in doing so loosens the knots in your mind. And whether it's 5 minutes or 50, you emerge slightly transformed. Maybe not wiser, but definitely warmer. Maybe not lighter in soul, but definitely lighter in hair volume. And as personal hygiene became emotional hygiene, society began developing new standards. Ones that went far beyond soap and shampoo. Cleanliness became a performance. The scent you wore said something about your ambition. The state of your nails hinted at your reliability. The freshness of your breath became an unspoken resume. People didn't just want to be clean, they wanted to look like they had never been dirty. This led to strange trends. Charcoal toothpaste, dry brushing, 10-step skincare routines involving serums with names that sound like science fiction. There's something deeply funny about how we swung from fearing water to misting our faces every 2 hours with glacial rose essence. It's as if we're still overcompensating for the centuries we spent thinking soap is suspicious. But somewhere beneath the commercial noise, a quieter truth remains. Bathing reconnects us to our humanity. It slows us down, even when the world won't. And that's not a modern invention. Even the ancients, in their own muddled way, were trying to do the same. They may have used animal fat and holy water, but the impulse was the same, to feel whole again, to wash off more than just dirt, to reset, restart, rebalance. Maybe that's why we associate baths with childhood, with being cared for, with warmth and bubbles and someone checking the temperature before you step in. A time when being clean didn't mean you were worthy, but simply that someone loved you enough to rinse away the day. As adults, we try to recreate that feeling. We light candles, lower ourselves into the tub, and hope that for just a few minutes the world outside can wait. And, if we're being honest, bathing has become one of the few socially acceptable forms of solitude left. You can't tell people, I need 30 minutes to stare into the void, but you can say, I'm going to take a long shower, and everyone will nod in respect. It's a timeout for grown-ups, a way to press pause without guilt, and if you happen to cry in there, even better. The water will hide your tears and give you credit for exfoliating. This quiet evolution, from medieval terror to modern ritual, reminds us that history isn't just about what we believed. It's about what we needed. Back then, we needed protection. Now, we need peace. Back then, bathing was risky. Now it's essential. And somewhere in between, we discovered that maybe the greatest luxury isn't hot water or fancy soap, but the permission to stop, to step away, to shed layers, to emerge, not just cleaner, but clearer. And still, after all this time, the act of bathing holds a final, almost magical question. If water can wash the body, what else might it help us let go of? Somewhere behind the quiet hum of modern showers, the soft rustle of towels, the click of shampoo bottles, and the echo of your own voice singing off-key into the tiles, there's a history that never quite got washed away. A ghost of grime past. Because for every comforting bath we take today, there were centuries of chaos, confusion, and sheer stubbornness that shaped how we got here. And the funny thing is, many of those ancient habits didn't just vanish. They morphed. Take, for example, the way we obsess over our routines now. Morning rituals, nighttime rituals, hair masks, scalp scrubs, 10-step skincare systems with names that sound like secret military projects, glycolic acid, retinoid complex, niacinamide serum. Oh, it's as if we've traded goat blood for glow oil and never even questioned it. Our ancestors anointed themselves with ashes and animal fats to please the gods. We do it to please our front-facing cameras. Different altars, same devotion. And just like then, cleanliness still comes with social currency. It's not just about being clean, it's about signaling that you have the time to be clean. The time to soak, to exfoliate, to hydrate, to moisturize, to jade, roll your puffy under eyes after a long night of doom scrolling. The modern hygiene ritual is both a declaration of self-care and an unspoken flex, because nothing says, "I've made it," like matching white towels and a eucalyptus-scented diffuser. This obsession with ritualized hygiene has opened the door to something even more bizarre: competitive cleanliness. Social media has turned bathrooms into stages, routines into performances. People film themselves brushing their teeth like it's a cinematic masterpiece. A bubble bath, once a quiet retreat, is now an Instagram backdrop. Influencers balance wine glasses on bathtub trays next to hardcover books they'll never read, surrounded by rose petals that someone definitely had to vacuum up later. Hygiene, at this point, is practically a spectator sport. But while the tools have changed, soap now comes in jewel-toned bars and foaming gels instead of greasy lumps, the core motivation is eerily familiar: fear. Not of demons or divine punishment anymore, but of being judged, of not fitting in, of smelling off, of being perceived as lazy, careless, undesirable. The shame that once came from religious sin now comes from being the last person in the office to discover dry shampoo. And yet, underneath all the pressure, there's still something sincere happening. People don't just want to appear clean, they want to feel right. There's a kind of healing that happens when we take control over the body, when we scrub away a bad day, or soak away a week of stress, or emerge from the steam just a little more grounded. It's not superficial, it's survival. Because even in a world with 24/7 noise, relentless updates, and fluorescent lighting, we still crave the primal, simple pleasure of being renewed. That's why hotel showers feel so transcendent. They're not better, they're just detached from your real life. No laundry waiting outside the door, no to-do list etched into the foggy mirror, just warm water, fluffy towels, and the temporary illusion that everything is under control. You could be anyone in that moment. You could be the version of yourself who always remembers to floss. And isn't that part of it too? Hygiene has become about identity. We curate it. Personal scent, shampoo brand. Whether you're a bar soap purist or a body wash maximalist, it all says something. It's self-expression through cleanliness, a kind of soft armor. You might not control your job or the news or the weather, but by God, your cuticles will be flawless. But what we rarely acknowledge is how these rituals also reveal our vulnerabilities. You can't fake authenticity in the bathroom. That's where we're most ourselves. No audience, no filter. Just skin, water, and maybe a playlist that accidentally makes you cry because it reminded you of a childhood pet. That's the hidden magic of bathing. It connects us to the parts we usually ignore: the quiet grief, the private laughter, the small, strange human truths. And while we're here, let's talk about the absurd number of products we've invented for our bodies. Separate lotions for your elbows, your feet, your neck, your scalp, your inner thighs. There are serums that cost more than rent, brushes shaped like flowers, massagers that light up like a nightclub. Somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is rolling in his grave thinking, "All I had was a rag and a prayer." But deep down, we're doing what they tried to do in their own peculiar ways: keep the chaos at bay. Use the body as a starting point. Anchor ourselves to something we can touch when the rest of the world feels slippery. And maybe that's the most enduring thread through centuries of grime and grace: the belief that cleaning the body in some way can help clean the soul. So we keep washing. We keep pouring, scrubbing, rinsing. Not because we're dirty, necessarily, but because we need to believe that we can reset, that we can step out of the fog, towel off the past, and start over just a little better than before. And still, just under the surface of every smooth tiled bathroom and steaming shower lies a question older than plumbing. If we can scrub away the surface, what do we do with everything underneath it? There's something strangely primal about the sound of water hitting skin. It doesn't matter if it's the thunderous splash of a river or the steady rhythm of a shower head. It taps into something old, something ancient, buried deep in the collective memory of being human. Maybe that's why, despite centuries of confusion, aversion, and superstition, we always found our way back to it. Because beneath all the myths and perfumes, water has always meant one thing: return. Return to the body. Return to the moment. Return to the self. And yet, as we carved new habits out of old fears, one thing never quite left us: the ritual. Even today, our hygiene routines follow patterns so precise they border on superstition. Lather twice, rinse 3 times. Pat, don't rub. Moisturize within exactly 30 seconds of towel drying, or the skin barrier will spontaneously combust. According to every beauty influencer ever, we've replaced sacred incantations with skincare instructions, but the rhythm remains. We still perform ablutions with the reverence of monks and the desperation of people trying to avoid aging. But what's fascinating isn't how we wash, it's how we prepare to wash. The mental checklist, the gathering of tools, the choosing of the playlist or podcast or silence. It's a build-up, like the overture before the opera. Bathing isn't just a physical act anymore, it's a personal ceremony. We light candles not because we need them, but because they feel right. We fold the towel just so. We set intentions, even if we don't say them out loud. Let this bath wash away the meeting that should have been an email. That shift, from practical to symbolic, mirrors something we've always done. Because when water became accessible, predictable, even ordinary, we had to fill it with meaning. Clean skin is great, but feeling emotionally rinsed? That's the real addiction. We don't just bathe to remove grime. We bathe to reclaim something we lost during the day. Maybe it's composure. Maybe it's patience. Maybe it's the will to talk to people again tomorrow. Whatever it is, it's always waiting on the other side of that towel. This is why we have phrases like wash it all away or a clean slate. Because deep down we still believe in water's power to reset more than just the surface. It's not logical, it's emotional. The same way a crying shower session feels like a silent therapy appointment. No words, no advice, just steam and gravity doing their work. You walk in a disaster and come out slightly less of one. What's even more interesting is how culture has evolved to support this quiet mythology. Take spas, for example. Entire industries built on the idea that soaking in warm water and being wrapped in eucalyptus-scented robes will heal the wounds of capitalism. And weirdly, sometimes it does, at least temporarily. The steam, the stillness, the soothing voice of someone asking if you want cucumber water, it's all part of a fantasy that we willingly pay for. A simulation of slowness in a world that demands speed. And yet, for all our candles and curated playlists, there's something sacred about the simplest bath. No products, no pressure, just you and the water. It's in those moments, when your fingers wrinkle, your mind drifts, and the heat quiets your thoughts, that something very old stirs. The same feeling that might have moved someone centuries ago, scrubbing with rough linen by a creek, hoping to feel human again. Even the tools we use have their own story. Loofahs, for instance, started as dried gourds. They weren't designed by dermatologists. They were harvested from vines. Now they're color-coded and sometimes infused with glitter, because if you're going to scrub yourself, you might as well sparkle. The bar of soap, once a brick of fat and ash, is now a symbol of identity. Goat's milk, charcoal, shea butter, exfoliating beads made from ground apricot shells that feel like sanding wood. Toothbrushes hum with micropulses. Razors have more blades than a Swiss Army knife, and towels must now be Turkish cotton or risk social exile. And yet, even in the middle of all this innovation, we still chase the same sensation. That moment when clean meets calm. That deep sigh as hot water hits your back. That quiet silence when your ears fill with steam. That invisible line you cross when you realize, even if just for a few minutes, that everything is okay. Not perfect, not solved, just okay. This is why we take long baths when we're heartbroken. Why we shower after funerals. Why we soak our feet after walking through cities that don't care if we exist. Because water doesn't ask questions. It doesn't analyze. It doesn't suggest you reframe your mindset. It just receives. It takes whatever you give it, sadness, sweat, confusion, rage, and carries it away. No judgment, no echo. And if you've ever stood in the shower after a particularly long day, staring at the tiles, not moving for a while because you forgot you had a body, that's part of it too. That pause, that nothingness, that strange gift of stopping, where nothing is demanded of you except to exist. You don't even have to do it well. Just stand there. Let the water run. Be as you are in that moment and let the rest fall where it will. Because under all the rituals and routines and rose-scented scrubs, what we're really doing is remembering that we are bodies, that we are breath, that we are more than the noise in our heads. And sometimes it takes a little water to remind us that we're still here. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And real, after all this time, might be the cleanest we've ever been. There's a moment, often unnoticed, often uncelebrated, that happens after the towel, after the robe, after the steam has faded and the mirror begins to reveal your face again. It's the pause. That small, quiet stretch of time when you've dried your skin, combed your hair, and stepped back into yourself. You're not fully dressed yet. You're not rushing. You're just suspended. Clean, yes, but more than that, cleared. And in that pause, something strange happens. The body feels like a home again. We don't talk about this enough. We talk about soap, about scent, about routines, but not about the gentle re-entry that comes after bathing. The moment when you feel more you than you did before you stepped into the water. It's subtle, nothing dramatic, just a softness, a slightly quieter mind, skin that breathes differently, clothes that touch you with less resistance, as if your edges have been softened, rounded, redefined. And somehow, this fleeting moment holds centuries within it. You're standing in a modern bathroom, sure, but you're also standing in the shadow of 1,000 generations who feared this very act, who avoided it, who ritualized it, who misunderstood it. And here you are, walking freely through the steam like it's always belonged to you. You don't even flinch. You don't negotiate with the water. You don't pray before picking up the soap. You simply live in the comfort they once found terrifying, which is funny, in a way. Because even now, with all our technology and scented candles and multi-step routines, we still wrestle with our bodies. We still doubt them, hide them, criticize them in mirrors, pretend they're temporary vehicles instead of permanent companions. But when you're freshly bathed, hair damp, body warm, skin slightly pink from heat, there's this rare moment where you don't want to change a thing. You want to stay just like that, uncluttered, unrushed, undisguised. We should build monuments to that feeling, or at least write poems about it. The post-shower peace treaty between body and mind. The stillness before the world gets its claws back in you. Because soon enough, you'll have to answer emails, deal with other people's energy, pretend your phone battery isn't at 3%. But for now, you're just a human wrapped in terry cloth, radiating steam and silence. And that's where hygiene becomes something more than maintenance. It becomes memory. A reminder that you are capable of care, that you can choose gentleness over neglect, that your body, for all its aches and noise and needs, is still worthy of being touched kindly. And that maybe, just maybe, it's not asking for perfection, just attention. Think of how strange that is historically. Not long ago, you'd be considered suspicious for wanting to bathe regularly, too clean, too vain, too obsessed with your appearance. Now, not washing makes you the social pariah. The pendulum has swung completely. Cleanliness went from a risk to a requirement, from whispered scandal to status symbol. And somewhere in that shift, we started to lose the idea that bathing was a gift, not a chore. It's easy to forget that clean water wasn't always available, that hot water was once a luxury, that towels were reused, dried stiff in the wind, and that privacy was a concept reserved for kings. Today, we shut the door, run the tap, and barely think twice. We scroll through our phones while rinsing shampoo. We rehearse conversations we'll never have. We process entire emotional arcs before stepping out of the shower. And we do it surrounded by tile, metal, and silence, like modern monks in tiny tiled monasteries. And even as we automate everything else in our lives, we still choose to bathe with our hands. No one has invented a robot to soap your back, yet. There's something stubbornly human about hygiene. It refuses to be fully outsourced. We want to feel the water, the texture, the temperature. We want to know it's us doing the cleansing. Maybe because we sense that no one else can do this part for us. Because ultimately, bathing is personal. Deeply, weirdly personal. It reveals how we treat ourselves when no one's looking. Are we fast and rough? Are we gentle and slow? Do we skip parts of ourselves out of habit or shame? Do we look at our bodies in the mirror or avoid our own gaze entirely? There are entire lifetimes hidden in how a person bathes. Not just what they do, but what they feel as they do it. Some scrub like they're trying to erase themselves. Some linger like they're trying to remember something. Some count the minutes until they can leave the room. Others never want to leave at all. And all of them, in some small way, are performing a ritual of return. To skin, to sensation, to softness. And maybe that's what makes bathing so enduring. Across centuries, cultures, continents, we've always found our way back to water. We feared it, yes, fought it, avoided it, misunderstood it, but we always returned. Because water, no matter how many times we've tried to redefine it, keeps offering the same quiet promise that we can begin again, not in a grand, dramatic way. Not with fireworks or declarations, just with soap, steam, and silence. And that's the kind of beginning that matters most. The one you give yourself, the one no one has to see, the one that doesn't need applause, just warmth, just breath, just you, clean, clothed and calm and ready to meet the world again on your own terms. And somehow, in that stillness, you realize maybe the most radical thing you can do is step out of that bathroom and carry that softness with you. Not just on your skin, but in your words, in your presence, in how you treat others. As if the cleansing never really ends, it just changes form. Because maybe the point of all this, after centuries of sweat, superstition, soap, and steam, isn't just to be clean, it's to remember that you're worth caring for, and always were. There is something deeply ironic about the fact that, after centuries of fighting off water with sticks, prayers, and perfume, We now spend entire fortunes trying to get closer to it, not just physically, because showers are no longer enough, but spiritually, aesthetically, emotionally. We want to be surrounded by water, but in the most curated, Pinterest-friendly way possible. Which is why, in a weird twist of fate, the bath, once the medieval epicenter of disease and moral panic, has now become a modern-day sanctuary. And not just any sanctuary, a luxury, a lifestyle, a statement. Step into any high-end hotel, influencer's reel, or wellness retreat, and you'll find a bathtub that looks less like a plumbing fixture and more like a holy altar. Stone-carved, freestanding, claw-footed, haloed by sunlight, surrounded by 11 strategically placed candles, and one overly dramatic eucalyptus branch draped artfully across the rim. Baths aren't just for getting clean anymore. They're for being seen, even if you're the only one in the room. And what's fascinating isn't just the design, it's the intention. People now bathe for energy alignment, for manifestation, for letting go of their ex, for boosting their immune system with pink Himalayan salts harvested under a full moon, because clearly regular Himalayan salts wouldn't dare. Baths have gone from functional to ritualistic once again, but this time willingly. No one's forcing you to soak in rosemary-infused milk while listening to a playlist called Rebirth Through Steam. You chose that. You downloaded it. Maybe that's what makes it beautiful. We've reclaimed something that was once wrapped in shame and made it into an act of care. We bathe not to hide from disease, but to face ourselves, which is harder, honestly. Dirt is easy to scrub off. Shame, guilt, burnout. That takes more than soap. That takes intention. And maybe a little lavender. But there's a fine line between intention and marketing. For every honest, quiet bath taken in stillness, there are 10 products whispering that you're not doing it right. Your water isn't detoxifying enough. Your bath bomb didn't fizz long enough. Your skin isn't glowing like the woman in the ad who has a personal lighting technician in her bathroom. Somewhere along the way, even our most sacred rituals became another item on the productivity list. Bathe, relax, glow, post about it, repeat. And yet, when the door is closed and the phone is face down and the bubbles rise and the water wraps around you like silence finally remembered, it still works. It doesn't matter if your tub is porcelain or plastic, freestanding or crammed next to the toilet. It doesn't matter if you have fancy oils or just a bar of soap you got on sale. What matters is the pause, the warmth, the breath that leaves your chest when you realize you haven't exhaled all day. There's power in that moment. In remembering that, you're more than your deadlines, more than your inbox, more than the roles you play for other people. You're a body in water, a mind finally not performing, a person simply being, and the water, for all its trends and branding and rituals, doesn't care who you are. It just holds you. That's the real magic, this universal neutrality. Water has no judgment, no demands. It doesn't ask you to prove your worth before it embraces you. It doesn't care if you cried 3 times this week or haven't replied to that one message. It doesn't know what you look like in jeans, or if your fridge is empty, or if you accidentally Googled your symptoms and convinced yourself you were dying. It just receives. And that's something rare in today's world. To be received without expectation, to be held without being fixed, to be allowed to simply exist. Maybe that's why people keep turning their bathrooms into temples and their bathtubs into confessionals. Because in a culture obsessed with performance, water asks for nothing but presence. It's no surprise, then, that even our language is soaked in metaphors of water and rebirth. Let it go. Go with the flow. Clean break? Wash your hands of it. We don't just want to rinse our bodies. We want to rinse our regrets, our grudges, our restlessness. We want to step out of the tub not just clean, but cleared. And somehow, in the middle of all this, we've returned to something that medieval people, without understanding, feared with reason. The vulnerability, the exposure, the raw, quiet intimacy of being naked, wet, alone. Bathing is one of the few acts where we are both physically and symbolically stripped down. That's always been the true power of it. Not the soap, not the scent, but the surrender to water, to silence, to yourself. And it's not always pretty. Sometimes the mirror fogs and you cry. Sometimes you catch your own reflection and sigh. Sometimes you feel the weight you carry pressed against your spine in the tub, and it aches more than your back. Sometimes all the rituals in the world can't keep the thoughts away, but you stay in the water anyway. You let it wrap around you like time doesn't exist. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Because maybe the point was never to come out glowing. Maybe the point was to come out softened. Not bleached of pain, but gentler with yourself. More forgiving. Less at war. Because after everything, after the centuries of filth and fear, of ritual and repression, of soapless superstition and scented overcompensation, what bathing has really taught us is that to care for the body is to remember you have one, and that it matters, not just as a tool or problem or project, but as a place to live. And every time you step into the water, you're choosing to return to that place, to listen, to tend, to believe, even briefly, that the noise outside can wait. And sometimes that belief, no matter how brief, is everything. Somewhere in the rhythm of daily life, in the in-between moments we never think to name, there's a quiet truth most people overlook. How we return to ourselves is just as important as how we show up for the world. And more often than not, that return begins in water. Not the kind that blasts you awake like a punishment for snoozing your alarm 5 times, but the kind that welcomes. The kind that softens your breath before it touches your chest. The kind that makes you pause halfway through washing your hair just to close your eyes and stay. It doesn't seem revolutionary, but in a world that teaches you to hurry, even through rest, that stillness is nothing short of radical. Because bathing, when you strip away all the candles and sea salts and influencer aesthetics, is really just a form of listening. Not with your ears, but with your skin. And your skin, believe it or not, is always talking to you. Through tension, through tenderness, through that weird itch behind your knee you only notice in hot water. It holds the memory of everything you've walked through, both literal and emotional. And when the water hits it just right, it remembers how to soften. It's not about indulgence. That's the biggest misunderstanding. People think long baths and slow showers are luxuries you earn, but really, they're maintenance. For your nervous system, for your sanity, for your ability to keep saying yes to things that drain you. You don't wait until your car's engine explodes to give it oil, but somehow we wait until the breakdown before we let ourselves soak. And soaking, real soaking, is a whole experience. It's not just about being submerged. It's about dissolving, letting the edges blur, letting your to-do list melt into the bubbles, letting your body sink until the water holds more weight than your thoughts. It's one of the rare acts that doesn't demand performance. You don't have to pose, you don't have to win, you just have to float. That's why time seems to bend in the bath. 5 minutes becomes 20. The clock becomes irrelevant. Even the air feels different, thicker, slower, like it's taking a breath with you. And in that suspended space, all the noise that usually chases you around, the texts, the guilt, the headlines, the question of what's for dinner, fades. Not permanently, of course, but long enough for you to remember what silence feels like. And sometimes that's when the thoughts arrive, not the loud ones, the ones that whisper, the memories you didn't invite, the feelings you forgot you buried, the what-ifs that float up like bubbles. It's easy to dismiss them, to scrub them away like shampoo. But maybe, just maybe, they're showing up because this is the only place you ever slow down enough to hear them. Which is why the bathroom has quietly become the new confessional. Not in the holy sense, but in the honest one. It's where we rehearse conversations we'll never have. It's where we cry for reasons we can't name. It's where we strip not just our clothes, but our personas. The strong one, the funny one, the one who has it together. They all fall to the tile floor with yesterday's socks. And what's left is the version of you that simply is. That version is sacred. Not because it's flawless, but because it's real. And real is rare. Real doesn't apologize for soft bellies or stretch marks or the fact that your thighs make that funny sound when you sit on a wet surface. Real doesn't ask to be improved. It just asks to be witnessed. And bathing gives you the space to do that for once. Not through a filtered photo or someone else's gaze, but through your own. That's where the transformation happens. Not when you emerge glowing like a skincare commercial, but when you emerge knowing you were kind to yourself. Even just for a little while. Even if you didn't solve anything. Even if the bathwater didn't have magical healing properties blessed by Scandinavian nymphs. You took the time. And that time, uncapitalized, unmonetized, uninterrupted, is priceless. There's a certain rebellion in that too, in choosing slowness in a world that worships urgency, in choosing warmth when the world feels cold, and turning off the lights and soaking in silence when every screen begs for your attention. It's not laziness, it's literacy, in the language of your own body. And the body is always speaking, through tight shoulders, through clenched jaws, through the ache behind your eyes when you've scrolled too long. It doesn't lie, it doesn't negotiate, it just waits, patiently, until you finally hear it say, enough. So when you listen, and truly listen, it responds. The water feels warmer, the breath comes easier, the pulse slows, and somewhere, under all the foam and fog, a part of you thought was gone returns. A part that remembers who you are without all the striving. A part that isn't exhausted by being needed. A part that doesn't measure worth in productivity or likes or how well you kept it together at work. That part is still there. It always was. It's just been quiet, waiting for the steam to rise, the mirror to blur, and the world to fall away, just long enough for you to come back. And once you do, once you step out dripping and soft and slightly dazed like someone waking from a kind dream, everything feels just a little bit more possible. Not fixed, not perfect, just possible. Which, honestly, is more than enough. So you wrap yourself in a towel that smells faintly of fabric softener and thyme. You pat your skin dry instead of rubbing it raw because you finally realize it deserves tenderness. You look in the mirror and don't flinch. You don't critique, you just see yourself present, warm, real. And that sight, that simple act of being with yourself without trying to escape, is the cleanest thing of all. It's a strange thing, really, how something as simple as getting clean could end up so tangled in layers of meaning. We like to think of hygiene as straightforward: soap, water, rinse, done. But the truth is, it's never been just about dirt, never just about skin. Somewhere along the way, the act of bathing became a mirror, not the one above the sink, but the one that reflects everything we try not to think about. And the closer we get to that reflection, the more we realize we've never just been scrubbing away sweat. We've been trying to scrub away time. Because bathing, for all its physical benefits, has always flirted with the idea of renewal. Not just in a literal sense, but in that deeply human, slightly desperate hope that we can rinse off more than just the surface. That maybe, with enough steam and enough solitude, we can wash off the weight of our years, our choices, our cracks. No anti-aging cream has ever admitted this, but the real fantasy it sells is erasure, the chance to rewind, and we fall for it again and again. We pat dry and inspect ourselves like detectives looking for clues of who we used to be. We tilt our heads, stretch our skin, squint at fine lines like they're graffiti someone left on our face without permission. We run our fingers over places that used to feel different, tighter, firmer, more invisible, and wonder where the time went. It didn't go anywhere, of course. It stayed on us, in us, as us. That's what nobody tells you about aging. It doesn't just happen in the mirror, it happens in the rituals. The way you slow down, the way hot water starts feeling like medicine, the way you moisturize with more patience, not because the bottle says so, but because you finally understand that your body is not a problem to solve. It's a place to live. And maybe that's why bathing feels more sacred the older you get. Because you're no longer trying to be clean for someone else. You're not preparing to be seen. You're preparing to feel, to listen, to remember that you exist beyond your roles, beyond your obligations, beyond the mental tabs constantly open in your mind. You're not just wiping off the day, you're peeling back the layers of distraction. The funny thing is, the deeper this ritual becomes, the more you notice its absurdity. How you spend 10 minutes picking a bath oil like you're choosing a life partner. How you negotiate with yourself over whether to wash your hair or not like it's a tax audit. How the loofah becomes both a weapon of exfoliation and a symbol of how adult you've become. Somewhere between deciding if you should shave your legs and accidentally dropping the conditioner bottle on your toe, you realize that self-care is often equal parts comedy and grace. And yet, we keep doing it. Not out of vanity, but out of need. Because in the silence of water, there are answers. Small ones, maybe. Incomplete, but they come. You remember that you're tired, that you've been holding your breath emotionally, that maybe, just maybe, what you've been calling overwhelm is actually grief you didn't name, or fear, or longing, or just the simple ache of trying to keep up in a world that never slows down unless you make it. So you make it. You claim that space. You let the water hold what your spine has been carrying. And in those moments, when your fingers wrinkle, when the mirror fogs, when your heartbeat softens, you become less about what's next and more about what is. Not who you have to be tomorrow, not what you have to fix, just what it feels like to be a body in warmth, a mind in pause, a soul in progress. This is what people miss when they talk about hygiene as routine. It's not just routine, it's rhythm. And rhythm is how we remember that we are alive. Not in the big moments, the promotions, the parties, the milestones, but in the small ones. The breath between lathers, the tilt of your neck as you rinse, the silence that echoes back at you when you don't fill it with noise. And perhaps the most surprising thing of all is what comes after. When you step out, when the towel hugs you back, when the mirror starts to clear and your reflection returns. Not perfect, not polished, but softened, familiar. And you look at yourself not as a project or a problem, but as a person who is trying. And that trying? That's the most honest form of care there is. It doesn't matter if the sink is cluttered, if you forgot to rinse the tub, if your hair isn't cooperating or your skin still feels dry. What matters is that you showed up for yourself. In a world that's always asking for more, you stopped and gave something back to the one person who can't live without you. And maybe tomorrow you'll rush again. Maybe you'll skip the bath. Maybe life will get loud and you'll forget what this piece felt like. But you'll find your way back. You always do. Because your body remembers, your breath remembers, the water remembers, and so do you. There's a peculiar kind of honesty that emerges only when we're in a towel. It doesn't matter if it's plush, hotel-grade cotton, or a threadbare old thing you've had since college that smells faintly of laundry detergent and existential crisis. In that moment, barefoot, damp, wrapped in softness, you are, strangely, the most yourself. You're not dressed to impress, not layered in social expectations or fashion choices. You're just a human being, slightly pruny, quietly pulsing with warmth, thinking about nothing and everything all at once. And maybe that's the final miracle of bathing, the afterglow, that specific feeling of having just emerged from warmth, like something sacred and secret has just occurred but no one else can see it. You've walked through steam and emerged on the other side, somehow cleaner not just in body but in thought. And now, with water droplets still clinging to your skin like punctuation marks, you face the stillness. What now? Some people rush. They dry fast, dress fast, get on with it. Others linger. They sit on the edge of the tub, legs dangling, letting gravity do half the drying. They stare at nothing. They trace shapes in the fogged mirror. And in that pause, long or short, silent or filled with the sound of dripping faucets, there's an invitation to re-enter the world a little differently. Slower, softer, maybe even wiser, though let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's a funny little truth here. Clean people think better. Maybe not smarter, maybe not more rationally, but clearly, bathing recalibrates. Not just the nervous system, but the mind's cluttered hallway. Thoughts that felt heavy before the shower suddenly feel like they've had their edges sanded down. Urgencies lose their sting, arguments soften. Your inner monologue, usually a chaotic parade of demands and judgment, starts speaking in lowercase. It's not magic, it's chemistry. Warm water activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of you that says, hey, maybe you're not being chased by a lion, maybe it's okay to exhale. And when the body believes that, the mind follows. That's why your best ideas come in the shower. That's why you suddenly remember your cousin's birthday while shampooing your scalp. That's why, for just a moment, you think you could forgive them. Or at least stop drafting that revenge email in your head. And as your body starts to cool, something shifts. You begin layering back on the pieces of the day. Moisturizer, underwear, socks. It's almost ceremonial, like putting on armor, but not the heavy kind, more like soft padding. A quiet readiness. The world hasn't changed while you were in there, but you have. Just enough to face it again. What's wild is how little we recognize this transformation. We dismiss it, call it cleaning up, but it's so much more than that. It's reset. It's re-entry. And the way you step out of the bathroom often determines how you step into your next interaction. Have you ever noticed how freshly showered people are slightly more generous, more patient, more prone to saying, it's fine, and actually meaning it? You begin to see yourself not as someone perpetually overwhelmed, but as someone with agency. Not control exactly, let's not romanticize, but presence. The ability to respond rather than react, to notice rather than scroll, to ask someone how they're doing and actually listen to the answer instead of calculating when it's your turn to speak. All because you paused. All because you took time to rinse off everything that wasn't truly you. There's even a certain elegance to post-bath slowness. That meandering gait, the damp footprints on the tile, the lazy wrapping of hair in a towel that never stays up. These aren't just functional movements, they're expressions of something deeply tender. Like your body is saying, thank you for remembering I exist. And for once, you listen. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you notice the ordinary things with new eyes. The hum of the ceiling fan, the softness of your favorite worn-out shirt, the way your skin smells faintly of citrus or cedarwood or whatever that bottle promised when it said renewal. It probably didn't change your life, but it reminded you that life could be felt, and that's rare. That's why the best baths are the ones with no agenda. Not the ones where you try to multitask or optimize or exfoliate your way to enlightenment, but the ones where you just exist, where you don't check your phone or read the label on the body wash for the 100th time, where you let your mind wander without holding its leash. In those moments, time bends. You lose track, not because you're distracted, but because you're present, fully, not pulled into the future or looped in the past. Just there, breathing, soaking, being. And when you finally return to the rest of the house, something follows you. Not steam, not scent, but a subtle shift, a lighter step, a slower breath, a quieter mind, the kind of change no one else may notice, but you do. You carry it like an invisible thread woven through your clothes, your voice, your gaze. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's not meant to be. Some transformations are gentle on purpose, and maybe that's what bathing teaches us in the end, not just how to be clean, but how to return, over and over, when the world is too loud, when your thoughts are too sharp, when everything feels like too much. You can step into the water and remember softness, remember breath, remember yourself, because no matter how long the day has been or how far from yourself you've wandered, water waits, patient, honest. And when it touches your skin, it doesn't ask who you were 5 minutes ago. It just welcomes you back. There's a kind of intimacy in being freshly clean that's hard to describe. Not romantic intimacy, not even emotional intimacy, though those can follow, but something quieter, something that exists entirely between you and yourself. That moment when your skin is still a little warm, when your towel clings to your shoulders like a promise, when you feel lighter and looser, not because you lost something, but because you remembered something, that your body isn't just a machine you drag through deadlines, it's a place, a home, and you've just tidied up. It's amazing how easily we forget that. How quickly the outside world convinces us our bodies are only valuable if they're doing something productive or looking a certain way. But there's a rebellion in caring for your body without a goal. Not to impress, not to fix, just to tend, to nurture, to reconnect. Because even though water rinses away sweat and dirt, what it really does is uncover what's underneath all the performance. And maybe that's why the quiet after a bath feels so strange. It's not just that you're clean. It's that you're undefended. There's no armor left, no cologne cloud, no strategic outfit, no curated posture, Just your bare self, damp and blinking and slightly surprised by your own softness. It's like standing in front of a mirror and thinking, oh, there I am. This might explain why so many ancient cultures connected bathing with clarity. The Romans didn't just bathe, they discussed politics, philosophy, and poetry in the steam. The Japanese developed the art of onsen and sento, not for hygiene alone, but for purification of both spirit and mind. The Turks built hammams where strangers could be scrubbed to the brink of reincarnation and still leave feeling reborn. These weren't accidents. These were civilizations that knew something we often forget. The body and the soul are not separate guests in this house. They share a room. And when that room gets too messy, everything inside it suffers. But modern life doesn't make that easy. The faster we move, the less time we give ourselves to feel. We rush the shower, skip the soak, trade warm water for dry shampoo and face wipes that smell like regret. And then we wonder why we feel disconnected, not just from others, but from ourselves. Sometimes we don't even realize how long it's been since we last touched our own skin with intention. That's where the ritual returns, not the performative kind, the real kind. The kind where you shut the door and leave the world outside. The kind where you run the water a little hotter than you should, where you light the candle, even if no one's watching, where you take 5 extra minutes to moisturize, slowly, lovingly, like your skin belongs to someone you're trying to apologize to. Because maybe it does. Maybe the parts of you that ache the most aren't asking to be fixed. Maybe they're just asking to be noticed. And in that noticing, something else happens. Something incredibly inconvenient and deeply human. You start to feel things, not just the water, not just the heat, but the emotional residue that clings like invisible dirt. That passive-aggressive email you reread 12 times. That thing your mother said on the phone that lodged under your ribs. That weird heaviness in your chest you couldn't explain at the meeting, but couldn't shake either. Suddenly, it all shows up. Not as thoughts, but as sensation, as tightness, as fatigue, as tears you didn't expect. This is what the world doesn't warn you about in self-care routines, that the moment you slow down, the truth comes rushing in. And it doesn't care if you're wearing a robe and cucumber eye patches. It comes anyway, because water doesn't just cleanse, it reveals. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's the whole point. Because we spend so much of our lives performing competence, acting like we've got it all figured out, like we're fine, like we're not unraveling a little every Tuesday afternoon when the silence gets too loud. And then we enter the water. We drop the roles, and we finally tell the truth. Not out loud, but in the way we breathe, in the way we let the water carry the weight we never told anyone we were holding. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. And as you stand there, skin still damp, heart still open, you might find yourself thinking thoughts you forgot you were capable of. Not big ones, not solutions, just clarity, just quiet, just a slow return to center. And in that return, you find something even more precious than calm. You find a choice, the choice to begin again, to step back into your life, not rushed, not armored, not distracted, but aware of your breath, of your steps, of your needs, of the fact that maybe you don't have to keep outrunning yourself. Maybe you can build a life that includes softness, that makes space for recovery, that treats rest not as a reward, but as a right. Because what if your worth wasn't measured by how much you get done, but by how well you come home to yourself? And what if that home wasn't something you had to earn, but something you already are? That's what bathing teaches us, over and over if we let it. Not how to impress, not how to hustle, but how to remember, how to return, how to be whole in a world that keeps trying to pull us apart. So the next time you step into that water, whether it's a quick rinse before a long day or drawn-out soak with a book you'll never finish, know this. You're not just washing away the day. You are washing toward yourself. And that, perhaps, is the cleanest truth of all. There's something oddly philosophical about watching water spiral down a drain. You'd think it's just physics, just the end of a bath, just the natural consequence of pulling a plug. But sometimes, if you've been paying attention, it feels like a little more than that. Like you're watching a piece of the day leave you. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. There's no orchestral swell, no tearful monologue, but in the quiet way things actually leave us. Slowly, quietly, almost without permission. It's funny how we act like bathing is a pause, when really, it's a letting go. And not just of sweat or dirt or dead skin cells, although, yes, bless the water for taking all of that with it. It's also the mental clutter, the half-formed arguments, the unanswered texts echoing in the back of your brain, the tone of someone's voice that lingered in your ribs long after the conversation ended. You step into the bath thinking you're just tired, but sometimes you step out realizing you were carrying a sadness with no name, and the water knew. Of course, we don't always want to admit that our bathrooms are our temples now. It feels silly, maybe even indulgent, to assign meaning to something as mundane as a shower. But the truth is, most people don't have quiet chapels anymore. We have tiles and towels and 10 minutes of solitude before someone knocks on the door asking if we've seen the remote. So we make do. We build sanctuaries with steam and soap. And in that tiny space, we negotiate peace with ourselves. That's where memory gets slippery too. You start washing your hair and suddenly remember something from third grade. Some weird moment that meant nothing at the time but suddenly feels like a parable. Or maybe you recall a version of yourself you haven't visited in years. Maybe you wonder what they'd think of you now. Maybe you realize they're still in there, soaking with you, waiting to be acknowledged. This is the strange gift of bathing. It blurs time. You become more than the sum of what you did today. You become everything you've survived, every version of you that got you here. The kid who hated baths, the teenager who soaked too long because it was the only place they could cry without being interrupted, the adult who sometimes forgets that water isn't just for rinsing, it's for remembering. And then there's the comedy of it all, because just when you're on the verge of some great epiphany, the water turns cold. Or you drop the soap and nearly dislocate your shoulder trying to grab it. Or you catch a glimpse of yourself in the mirror and realize you've had a shampoo foam eyebrows for the last 5 minutes. These are the small, ridiculous reminders that being human is both sacred and deeply absurd. We light candles like we're in a spa commercial, then realize we forgot to replace the razor blade we've been using since the Paleolithic era. We buy artisanal soaps that smell like a morning fog on a mountainside, and still can't remember which shampoo is for volume and which is for damage repair. It's a balancing act between ritual and ridiculousness, and honestly, that's what makes it beautiful, because we're not aiming for perfection here. We're aiming for presence. And sometimes presence looks like a luxurious 30-minute soak with eucalyptus and jazz music, and sometimes it looks like a 5-minute rinse while eating a granola bar, because life doesn't always cooperate with your Pinterest board. But whether it's grand or gritty, bathing reconnects us to something we often lose track of, the act of tending. We tend to ourselves in water, not in the self-improvement, glow up, optimize everything kind of way, but in the quiet way, the I see you body, I hear you heart, let's breathe for a second kind of way. And when we do that regularly, something interesting starts to happen. We begin to make space for that same tenderness outside the bath. We speak more gently. We pause before reacting. We say, I don't know, without shame. We listen, not just to others, but to our own fatigue, our own joy, our own discomfort. It doesn't make us perfect. It just makes us available to ourselves, to the moment, to the possibility that this day could still surprise us. The after effect of bathing isn't just clean skin, it's softened edges. It's the reminder that maybe you don't need to fight through everything, that maybe you can just float, even for a little while. And you know it worked because the world feels slightly different when you re-enter it. The light seems kinder. Your clothes feel less like armor and more like comfort. You might even make better decisions, like not answering that passive-aggressive email, or choosing tea instead of caffeine-induced regret, or texting someone you miss just to say hi instead of waiting for the perfect opening line you'll never send. It's a chain reaction of calm. And that's the part no one talks about, that bathing, at its best, makes you more relational, not just toward others, but toward yourself. You stop treating your body like an employee and start treating it like a companion. You stop treating your feelings like inconveniences and start treating them like visitors. Some stay longer than you'd like, some teach you something, some leave the towel on the floor. But at least you're letting them in. So the next time you find yourself staring at the water swirling away, don't rush it. Watch it. Let it take the noise. Let it take the pressure. Let it take whatever you no longer need to carry into tomorrow, because you'll dry off, you'll get dressed, you'll step back into the world with dishes in the sink and emails to answer and bills that still don't pay themselves, but somewhere under all that, you'll know something quiet and strong. You came back to yourself, and the cleanest thing about you isn't your skin, it's the intention, the fact that you stopped, that you noticed, that you remembered. And sometimes that's all it takes to begin again. There's a moment, quiet, delicate, and nearly invisible, that happens after the towel comes off, but before the clothes go on. It's that in-between space where time slows and the world hasn't fully reclaimed you yet. You're warm, clean, slightly foggy in the head from heat, and utterly yourself in a way that feels almost too honest. No armor, no presentation, no posture to maintain, just skin and breath and the vague awareness that for a few more seconds you belong only to yourself. That space is where softness lives. Not weakness, real softness. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind that comes not from being untouched by life, but from having survived it and still choosing gentleness. This is the part most people skip over. We're so used to rushing from one thing to the next, so trained to fill silence, cover skin, and move forward, that we miss the invitation in that pause. The invitation to feel the after, not the glamorous after, not the I look amazing in this robe kind of after. The real one, the slightly damp, slightly vulnerable, slightly stunned sense that maybe you've just returned from somewhere deep, like a mini expedition into your own nervous system. And now you have to figure out how to come back to the surface without forgetting what you found. And what you find isn't always pleasant. Sometimes, in that afterglow, what surfaces is grief, or regret, or loneliness you didn't realize had been hiding in the soles of your feet. You're not crying necessarily, but there's a tightness, a hollowness, like something inside you has exhaled, and in doing so, revealed the echo of a need you haven't named yet. It makes sense, though. Bathing, true, intentional bathing, has a way of quieting the external noise long enough for the internal noise to finally speak. It's like when a room goes silent and suddenly you hear a buzzing you hadn't noticed before. That buzzing is you, your thoughts, your feelings, your body trying to remind you of what it's been carrying while you've been pretending everything's fine. And let's be honest, fine is the most overused lie in modern vocabulary. It's the emotional duct tape we use when we're too exhausted to explain the real mess. But water sees through fine. It has a way of dissolving pretenses. You can't lie to water. You can try, sure, but good luck holding onto your bravado when you're half naked. Your hair is doing that weird gravity-defying thing, and you've just dropped your conditioner bottle on your toe for the second time. That's the comedic balance of bathing. You're having a spiritual awakening while trying not to slip on a wet tile. Enlightenment with a splash of humility. It's like the universe saying, yes, heal, but don't get cocky. And maybe that's the beauty of it, that you can have both. The deep and the ridiculous, the sacred and the soapsuds, that healing doesn't have to look like crystals and perfect playlists. Sometimes it looks like sitting on the toilet lid in a towel, staring at the floor, trying to remember if you've used body wash or if you just imagined that step. Because healing isn't tidy, it's not aesthetic. It doesn't come with a tutorial. It shows up unannounced in these odd little moments. When you're rubbing lotion into your legs and suddenly feel a wave of sadness you can't name. Or when you notice a scar you stopped thinking about years ago and realize it's still teaching you something. Or when you catch your own reflection mid-sigh and think, I didn't know I was that tired. These moments matter, not because they're dramatic, but because they're real. And reality, unfiltered, unposed, unpolished, is where true softness begins. It's in the way you speak to yourself in the mirror, not in the loud affirmations, but in the quiet tone you use when noticing your flaws. It's in the decision to take 5 more minutes before getting dressed. It's in the way you gently pull a shirt over clean skin, not to hide, but to continue caring. Because that's the thing no one tells you about softness. It requires discipline. It takes work to be gentle in a world that teaches you to rush. It takes courage to pause when everyone else is sprinting. It takes intention to treat your body like a friend and not a task. And once you begin, really begin, to approach your body with that kind of presence, something shifts. You stop measuring it by its output. You stop blaming it for your discomfort. You start listening. You start asking what it needs instead of what it owes. And it answers, not with words, but with ease, with calm, with a quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself in front of anyone else. That's the paradox. The cleaner you are, the more human you feel. Not pristine, not perfect, but aware of your limits, your edges, your warmth. And in that awareness, you find a kind of confidence no outfit can give you. The kind that comes from knowing yourself beneath the surface. The kind that lingers even after the water is gone. And that's why we return. Again and again. Not just to remove grime, but to remember gentleness. Not to perform, but to practice presence. Not to escape life, but to re-enter it with more honesty. So the next time you step into that post-bath moment, the one where everything feels a little brighter, a little slower, a little more possible, don't rush through it. Stay a moment longer. Sit with it. Let it fill you up before you rejoin the noise. Because that feeling, that softness, that's not the end of the bath. It's the beginning of you. There's something darkly impressive about a civilization that genuinely believed that rubbing a dead animal's fat into their pores was a pathway to wellness. Welcome to another chapter in medieval hygiene, where hope was high, soap was scarce, and people sincerely thought that garlic, rosemary, and a splash of vinegar could erase both their sins and their smell. Let's just say, science had not yet RSVP'd to this party. We often think of medieval people as uneducated or naive. But in their minds, they weren't dirty. They were seasoned. A little layer of filth wasn't seen as gross. It was protective. After all, if demons were real, why not assume that a thick coat of grime might confuse them? Is this a human or a swamp? If the devil couldn't tell, maybe you were safe. Some even believed that washing too often made you vulnerable. Imagine your immune system being described not in terms of antibodies, but in terms of how much fermented foot odor you could emit at will. It's like they thought bacteria were bullied into submission by sheer stench. Honestly, if I were a pathogen and someone bathed once every 3 years and wore wool year-round, I'd back off too. But behind these odd beliefs was something strangely poetic. This idea that the body was a vessel of suffering, and cleansing it too thoroughly was a kind of vanity. They didn't bathe because they believed dirt reminded you of death. Yes, a bit extreme. But then again, have you ever tried getting medieval mud out of linen without a washing machine? That's a spiritual exercise on its own. Of course, let's not forget the role of religion in all this. Many devout figures associated bathing with sin, especially when it was done in public baths. There was something scandalous about being naked, even among other people who were also naked, which admittedly is still pretty awkward today. just with better lighting and eucalyptus steam. But these religious objections weren't just about morality, they were about control. Public bathhouses weren't just for cleansing, they were social hotspots. And when people gather, ideas spread. And when ideas spread, power gets nervous. Suddenly, a place where people were supposed to scrub their elbows becomes a breeding ground for rebellion and philosophical debates, all while someone's trying to exfoliate with stale bread. Yes, that happened. Medieval loofahs were not gentle. Still, as time crept forward and plagues began to wipe out entire cities, people started connecting the dots between filth and death. Not quite scientifically, of course, but emotionally. There was a growing unease, a silent suspicion that maybe all those layers of protection were actually part of the problem. And this is where you begin to see a shift. Not a full bath revolution, but a murmur of curiosity. What if cleanliness wasn't just vanity? What if it was survival? Enter the early proto-scientists, alchemists, physicians, herbalists, people who looked at mold and didn't just scream, they took notes, they experimented, often poorly, often with themselves, often with results that involved boils, hallucinations, and the occasional explosion. But they were trying, and from their chaotic attempts, something beautiful emerged. Questions. Questions like, what if rosemary actually doesn't cure smallpox? Or should my hair be smoking after applying this miracle tonic? And of course, the classic, what do you mean leech therapy caused more bleeding? These were primitive inquiries, but revolutionary for the time. Curiosity started to compete with superstition. Not replace it, mind you, just challenge it to a duel. And sometimes that duel happened in someone's backyard, with a cauldron, a goat, and a very confused apprentice. Eventually, these whispers of reason grew louder, and hygiene began to tiptoe into the realm of responsibility. Not because people suddenly cared about body odor, but because they started noticing patterns, like how monks who lived near clean springs seemed to survive longer, or how babies washed in herbal water didn't die as often. These were crude observations, but they hinted at something crucial. The human body responded to care, not always predictably, and certainly not always immediately. But over time, a kind of intuitive wisdom began to develop. Part science, part superstition, part stubborn hope. A belief that maybe, just maybe, the body wasn't meant to be ignored or punished, but listened to, nurtured, respected. And when you think about it, that realization is more revolutionary than any potion or ritual, that after centuries of steamless scrubbing and onion-scented foot baths, humanity began to suspect that care and survival might be connected. That cleansing wasn't just about looking presentable, but about acknowledging that this body, this strange, squishy, miraculous meat suit, is the only home we truly have. Of course, that didn't mean people stopped doing bizarre things in the name of cleanliness. In fact, it often meant they doubled down. If bathing once helps, surely bathing in boiling milk while chanting Latin will cure death itself. The optimism was there. The science, not so much. Still, every now and then, a practice emerged that actually worked. A flour that soothed inflammation, a broth that fought infection, a vinegar rinse that kept lice away. Small victories, often discovered by accident, but cherished like sacred secrets. And passed down, whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, from apothecary to apprentice. And isn't that the heart of progress? Not the flashy breakthroughs, but the quiet ones. The slow, stubborn, fumbling attempts to do better. To suffer less, to live longer. Not in opulence, but in understanding. Because ultimately, the story of medieval hygiene isn't just about filth or foolishness. It's about people doing the best they could with what they had. And occasionally rubbing goose fat on their cheeks because someone swore it brought youth. And if we laugh at that today, maybe it's because we're not so different. We just have better marketing. Our miracle creams come in glass jars with French labels. Our tonics are gluten-free. Our rituals are wrapped in Instagram filters and spa playlists. But beneath it all, we're still just people trying to stay alive, feel clean, and find a little dignity in the process. And maybe, just maybe, that's the cleanest truth of all. You'd think that after centuries of trial and error, medieval folks would eventually stop putting ashes, moss, or animal urine into their personal care routines. But no, if anything, the Middle Ages doubled down on the weird. And not in a chaotic, oops, I accidentally invented gin kind of way, but more in a, yes, let's boil this root, whisper Latin to it, and smear it on our wounds because Jeff said it worked fashion. Jeff, for the record, was the village guy with one eye and a suspicious twitch. Why was he the medical reference? Nobody knows. Maybe because he was still alive. But life back then wasn't about logic. It was about survival and stories. The kind of stories where people believed that your soul could literally escape through your pores during a bath if you stayed too long in hot water. Imagine trying to relax in a tub, only to panic mid-soak thinking your spirit just floated out with the steam. That's not hygiene, that's horror. Still, there was a sort of beauty in how they tried. Take, for example, the use of rose petals in bathwater. Not for romance, don't get ahead of yourself, but to mask the stench of stagnant water reused by the entire household. The petals didn't cleanse, they camouflaged, which, in a twisted way, is kind of genius, like spraying perfume on a dumpster. It's still trash, but now it smells like disappointment and lavender. Of course, this was also the era of, if it burns, it's working. Medieval medicine was built on vibes, pain, and possibly the screams of whoever was your test subject. Have a rash? Boil leeks and smear them on it? Have a toothache? Put a dead mouse in your mouth. Yes, a mouse, dead, in your mouth. Let that visual live rent-free in your brain next time you complain about the taste of modern mouthwash. And let's talk about hair care, shall we? Oily scalps weren't a problem, they were fashion. Grease was seen as a protective barrier. Some even used pig lard to style their hair, creating elaborate shapes that, fun fact, could catch fire near candles. You think today's hairspray is flammable? Medieval buns were literally bombs waiting to happen. Romance by candlelight? Risky? Flirty glance? Maybe. Third-degree burns? Likely. Yet, underneath all that oil and superstition was a deep human desire to feel better, to transform, to be seen. People weren't just trying to survive plagues and famines. They wanted to feel elegant while doing it, even if that elegance meant rubbing powdered bones onto their cheeks to achieve a pale and fragile look, which was all the rage. The more you looked like you were dying of something, the more attractive you were. Because nothing says, date me, like the aesthetic of tuberculosis. The irony is, they were chasing the same thing we chase today, control. Over our bodies, over aging, over uncertainty. Only difference is, we have Sephora and dermatologists, and they had mud, prayer, and a goat. Yet the emotional need is the same, wanting to feel clean, to be admired, to believe you're doing something that works, even when science hasn't arrived yet with a clipboard and a white coat. Speaking of admiration, let's not forget medieval fashion's contribution to the hygiene struggle. You see, many noblemen wore dresses so tight they had to be sewn into them, no zippers, no elastic, just stitches and prayer. And since changing was a three-person event involving a servant, a stool, and a winch system, daily bathing became inconvenient, to say the least. Hygiene wasn't sacrificed because people were lazy. It was sacrificed because logistics said, not today. And yet, there was this strange sense of ritual to everything. Bathing wasn't just about removing dirt. It was spiritual, symbolic, baptismal, even if the water was murky and someone else had used it before you. The act itself, the gesture of submerging into something with intention, had power. It was a small rebellion against chaos, a statement that said, I matter enough to try, which, frankly, is still the heartbeat of self-care. Sure, today we've traded goat fat for retinol and spells for serums, but the motivation is the same. We exfoliate and moisturize not just to look presentable, but because it makes us feel like we have agency. Like we're not just being dragged through time by bills and algorithms, but choosing how to show up in the world, even if it's just with slightly better breath. The deeper you look into medieval hygiene, the more you realize they were improvising with conviction. They didn't know what germs were, but they knew what death smelled like. They couldn't name bacteria, but they remembered who didn't make it through last winter. And so they washed, badly, inconsistently, sometimes with beer, but they washed. And in doing so, they planted the seeds of something bigger, curiosity. Because behind every bizarre remedy was a question, a whisper in the mind asking, could this help? And that question, fragile, absurd, noble, is what carried humanity through the stench and into the light, through leech therapy and into penicillin, through pig lard pomade and into dry shampoo. So the next time you lather your overpriced body wash while listening to lo-fi beats in your rainfall shower, remember, you are the end result of thousands of years of strange decisions, of trial, error, panic, and persistence. You are what happened when people finally agreed, maybe boiling water is a good idea. You are the descendant of someone who didn't die from trying goat milk as deodorant. And honestly, that's something to be proud of. They say smell is the most powerful sense tied to memory. If that's true, then the average medieval town must have been one big collective trauma, preserved forever in the subconscious of humanity. Imagine walking through a cobbled street where every inhale delivers a bouquet of sweat, rotting vegetables, open sewage, and the faintest trace of last week's goat. And somewhere in that olfactory chaos, someone is trying to flirt. That's dedication. But you can't understand medieval hygiene without understanding medieval plumbing, or, more accurately, the glaring absence of it. There were no flushing toilets, no pipes gurgling beneath the floors, no tidy little white thrones to contemplate existence. Instead, people had chamber pots. And those chamber pots didn't get flushed. They got tossed. Out the window, onto the street. With luck, someone shouted, "Garde lo!" before gravity did its thing. With less luck, you were the thing it landed on. This wasn't poor planning, it was the plan. Streets weren't just roads, they were drainage systems, social arenas, open-air toilets, and sometimes, regrettably, sleeping spots for the drunk or destitute. Rain didn't just cleanse, it redistributed. The very idea of water being clean depended more on wishful thinking than any practical system. Wells were sacred, rivers were essential, and ponds, well, ponds were where fish went to die, and people went to pretend that was okay. Yet despite all this, people genuinely tried to live with dignity. Monks in particular had structured routines around cleanliness, not because they were germ conscious, but because spiritual purity was believed to be connected to physical order. Monastic life often involved washing hands before prayers and maintaining clean habits as a form of devotion. It's oddly touching, imagining a monk carefully scrubbing his hands in icy water, whispering psalms, while the world outside continued to stew in filth. Even barbers were spiritual multitaskers. Known as barber surgeons, these men cut hair, extracted teeth, and performed minor surgeries, all in the same chair, sometimes without cleaning their tools in between. It was a one-stop shop for grooming and bloodletting. The medieval version of self-care Sunday was getting a haircut, a good vein drained, and maybe losing a molar you didn't know was infected. And if you survived, you looked great. Pale from blood loss maybe, but sharp. Meanwhile, noblewomen were busy crafting their own routines of cleanliness, which often involved the delicate art of not bathing too often. Instead, they relied on layers of perfume, floral sachets tucked into their sleeves, and a rotating cast of powdered herbs. If you smelled lavender and sage as a guest entered the room, it wasn't ambiance, it was damage control. And speaking of control, few things were more ritualistic than the royal bath. These events, when they happened, weren't private moments of peace. They were public, performative, and symbolic. The king or queen might bathe once a year, if that, and the occasion required attendance, music, sometimes even witnesses. Water would be perfumed, heated by servants, and poured over the monarch like a benediction. It wasn't about being clean, it was about being seen being clean. Hygiene is theater. But theater has its masks, and the truth often lurked beneath scented veils. Consider the infamous urine diagnosis technique with services, where physicians would inspect, smell, and occasionally taste a patient's urine to determine illness. That's right, there was a whole medical field based on sipping pee. The real tragedy? Some of them were right. Yellow tint? Liver issue? Cloudy? Infection? Red? Congratulations, you've invented kidney failure. It's fascinating how desperation can lead to accuracy. Or nausea, often both. And still, with all these rituals and routines, most people had no idea what clean really meant. Microbes were a mystery, soap was a luxury, and bathing was often feared as a gateway for illness to enter the body. Heat opened pores, and open pores were believed to be portals for disease. So while we light scented candles and soak in lavender salt bliss, medieval folks were side-eyeing warm water like it owed them money. Yet for all their misguided methods, their instincts weren't always wrong. Natural antiseptics like garlic, onion, and honey were used with surprising success. Vinegar was a go-to disinfectant. Boiled wine was applied to wounds. Even charcoal found its way into treatments. Trial and error was messy, often deadly, but sometimes miraculous. People didn't need microscopes to sense that nature held answers. They just had to guess which ones wouldn't kill them first. And somehow, all of this, every moss-stuffed shoe, every soot-smeared face, every bowl of mint water passed as a mouthwash, tells a bigger story about resilience, about trying, failing, and trying again, about humans insisting on grace even when the world smelled like rot. That spirit, ridiculous and brave, is still with us. We just swapped leeches for lasers and decided not to throw our waste out the window, most of the time. There's something unsettlingly romantic about how medieval people viewed illness. Not romantic, as in hearts and flowers, more like candlelit confusion, superstition, and just a dash of divine punishment. If you sneezed twice and your left ear tingled, someone somewhere would blame it on an imbalance of your humors, a curse from a rival, or that goat you didn't bless last Thursday. Diagnosis in the Middle Ages was less about evidence and more about vibes. The concept of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, wasn't just pseudoscience. It was the backbone of medicine. Feeling lethargic? Too much black bile. Nosebleed? Obviously, excess blood. Melancholy? Also black bile. Existential dread? Definitely black bile. At some point, everything became about the biles. One wonders how anyone with a nervous stomach wasn't just declared a walking catastrophe. But here's where it gets wild. Treatments were usually just as dramatic as the symptoms. You'd think a headache would lead to a nap or maybe some herbal tea. Instead, enter the leech. Medieval physicians believed that letting blood out could balance the humors. So they applied leeches like stickers, nature's little vampires, chewing softly on your skin while everyone hoped your soul realigned. If leeches weren't available, they improvised. Blades, horns, heated cups. Basically, anything that could open the body and let something drip. It wasn't called torture, it was therapy. Bleed the badness out, they'd say, while the patient slowly reconsidered every life decision that led to that moment. Ironically, some patients did get better, not because the treatment worked, but because their bodies gave up and said, "Fine, you win, I'll stop being sick." Of course, not all ailments were treated with bloodletting. Some required more sophisticated approaches, like trepanation, the gentle art of drilling a hole into your skull to release evil spirits. Imagine being so desperate for relief, you let someone open your head without anesthesia, sterile tools, or even the courtesy of a countdown. And yet, people survived it. Some even improved. It's either a miracle or a testament to the human skull being impressively stubborn. But when things got really bad, when diseases spread like wildfire and bodies piled up faster than explanations, society turned to the only thing more powerful than science: fear. Plagues weren't just health crises, they were spiritual reckonings. Entire cities locked their gates, families abandoned the sick. Physicians wore those infamous bird masks filled with herbs, not because it helped, but because smelling lavender was slightly more pleasant than rotting flesh. And still, some brave souls tried to heal. Apothecaries mixed potions from every corner of the earth. Imagine a bubbling brew of saffron, honey, snakeskin vinegar, and powdered emerald, sold with the confident smile of someone who read half a book once. "Drink this," they'd say, "and the demons will flee." Maybe they did. Or maybe your stomach fled first. But in a world where hope was often homemade, even the most absurd remedy could become a ritual. Then came the relics: holy bones, saintly fingers, splinters from the true cross, objects believed to cure anything from blindness to boils. Pilgrims walked for weeks just to touch a toe bone in a golden box, weeping with faith and festering with infection. The placebo effect wasn't just real, it was spiritual. And perhaps, in some strange way, that faith did heal. After all, the mind is a powerful ally when the pharmacy is made of wood, beeswax, and divine mercy. But medicine wasn't just for the sick, it was also for the curious. There were manuals filled with bizarre facts, like sleeping with a dead mole under your pillow to cure epilepsy, or rubbing roasted cat fat on your chest to ease a cough. Somewhere between folklore and medical advice was a gray area where desperation met creativity. A place where someone once said, "You know what this rash needs? Boiled frog legs." And as absurd as it all sounds now, it was also deeply human. People wanted to live, they wanted to protect their children, heal their parents, survive long enough to see another harvest. That relentless pursuit of survival, even when guided by myths and misfires, is what carried humanity forward. Because somewhere in the middle of all that confusion and clove-scented chaos, people learned, they observed, they improved. Until slowly, century by century, someone asked, "What if we washed our hands?" And just like that, progress was born, not in a thunderclap, but in a quiet basin of warm water passed from one cautious soul to another. There's a special kind of irony in the fact that some of the filthiest places in the medieval world were the very spaces designed for cleanliness. Public bathhouses, those steaming dens of questionable hygiene and even more questionable decisions, weren't just about bathing. They were the medieval equivalent of a wellness spa, social club, gossip column, matchmaking agency, and occasionally makeshift courtroom. And if that sounds chaotic, it was. Imagine stepping into a wooden building filled with moist air, the scent of boiled herbs mingling with human sweat, wet wool, and, for some reason, onions. Always onions. Men and women alike shared these spaces, separated only by time slots or, when people felt particularly radical, by nothing at all. The water, reused over and over, was warmed by fire and infused with herbs like rosemary or lavender, not because it made anyone cleaner, but because it masked the odor of what came before you. Bathing in soup might sound relaxing until you realize you're the 43rd person to marinate in that broth today. Yet people swore by these rituals, not because they were clean in the modern sense, but because they were part of a rhythm. There was a kind of faith in the process, even when it involved scraping the body with blunt knives to remove dead skin, or being massaged by a stranger who'd also just rubbed down your neighbor. If medieval cleanliness had a slogan, it might have been not sanitary, but definitely communal. But cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was moral too. The church, in all its fragrant wisdom, often oscillated between praising cleanliness as a divine virtue and condemning bathhouses as sinful dens of temptation, which makes sense considering that many bathhouses also doubled as brothels. And if you're wondering how people didn't catch on to this double function, they did. They just didn't care. After all, where better to repent than right where you sinned? Forgiveness and a foot rub, all in one trip. Outside these steamy social hubs, personal hygiene was more improvisational. Without easy access to soap, water, or privacy, many resorted to dry bathing, essentially wiping themselves with cloths, herbs, or dusting powders. The logic was, if it smells nice and looks clean, it probably is. Think of it as the ancient version of spraying perfume instead of showering, except with fewer consequences because everyone smelled equally mysterious. Hair care followed the same philosophy. Washing it was rare, combing it was sacred, and shaving it, well, sometimes that was a medical recommendation. Monks went bald on purpose, but lice made sure no one stayed untouched. Delousing was a social activity. friends and family picking nits out of each other's hair while chatting about weather, war, and the neighbor's odd rash. You weren't clean unless someone had inspected your scalp with love and tweezers. And speaking of scalps, let's not forget the role of hats. Everyone wore them, not just for style, but to cover up the fact that underneath their hair hadn't seen water in months. Hats became little sanctuaries for fleas, lice, and occasionally thoughts. They weren't accessories, they were defenses. And when someone removed theirs indoors, it wasn't just respect, it was risk. Teeth, on the other hand, were a different battlefield. Toothbrushes didn't exist, but twigs did. People chewed on aromatic sticks to clean their teeth and freshen breath, which surprisingly worked, for about 5 minutes. Powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, or burnt bread were also used to polish teeth, though you have to wonder if anyone questioned the logic of scrubbing your gums with ash and fish skeletons. But hey, at least it wasn't leeches this time. Then there were the perfumes, those glorious, overwhelming concoctions meant to distract from everything else. Fragrances weren't subtle, they were statements. A noblewoman entering a room didn't announce herself, her scent did. Rosewater musk, civet, yes, the secretion from a cat's rear, all blended into a smell that said, I may not have bathed, but I tried. And really, effort was half the battle. What makes all of this oddly endearing is that people genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They followed the best advice of their time, made do with what they had, and invented rituals that made them feel whole. In the absence of science, they had stories. In the absence of data, they had tradition. And beneath the layers of dirt and uncertainty was a stubborn, beautiful hope that maybe, just maybe, they were doing enough. Because sometimes survival isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. It's about lighting a candle in the dark, even if that candle smells faintly of goat fat and disappointment. When people today talk about body care routines, they mention clay masks, vitamin serums, or perhaps a warm bath with Himalayan salt. In the Middle Ages, however, the equivalent of a deep cleanse involved applying mashed pigeon droppings to your skin and praying to a saint for minimal side effects. It wasn't self-care, it was medieval roulette. Pigeon feces, aside from being unpleasantly warm when fresh, was believed to cure blemishes, ease inflammation, and even whiten the skin, a prized feature associated with nobility, since being pale meant you didn't have to work outdoors. People willingly smeared themselves with what birds left behind on statues in the hope of achieving that courtly glow. Imagine waking up early, not to go for a jog or meditate, but to chase down a bird and scrape up its blessings. That, right there, is commitment. And then there were the poultices, thick, pasty mixes of herbs, dirt, blood, honey, or even wine, spread generously on the body. These weren't just for injuries. Some used them preventatively, thinking that coating their skin in goo would protect them from bad air or malevolent spirits. A man walking around with a face full of sticky brown paste wasn't deranged. He was, in fact, ahead of the hygiene curve. Kind of like how today's influencers wear charcoal masks on camera, except back then it wasn't for likes, it was for survival, or at least for not being the first to drop dead during a plague wave. Speaking of plagues, one of the most desperate and absurd rituals to prevent them was the belief in transference. The logic was simple. Illness could be passed on to another object or being, and you'd be miraculously cured. People would rub sores with raw meat and then throw that meat into the street. Somewhere in a medieval alley, a dog was probably having the worst lunch of its life. In other cases, they'd bury the clothes of a sick person, hoping the earth would absorb the disease. It's oddly poetic. Dirt to dirt, illness to worm. One popular belief was that diseases came from sin, and sin came from, well, practically everything. Laughing too much? Sin. Eating too well? Sin. Skipping church? Yeah, you might as well start digging your grave. As a result, personal hygiene became entangled with guilt. A person might avoid bathing not because of laziness, but because they were told it tempted vanity. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was dangerously close to pride, and pride was the gateway drug to damnation. So, instead of washing, some turned to religious rituals. Holy water was sprinkled not only on objects or people, but sometimes into bath water, when it was available, because who needed soap when you had sanctified H2O? Relics of saints were dipped into basins. In one French village, a toenail of Saint Bernard was placed in a public bath each spring to bless the waters. The toenail of a dead man, floating there as people soaked, all nodding solemnly as if this made perfect sense. And it didn't stop with saints. Astrology, too, got involved. Bathing during certain moon phases was discouraged, as it might invite bad luck or worsen one's humors. Some physicians swore that if you washed your hair under a waning moon, it would fall out. If it was raining, even worse. Rainwater, believed to have touched clouds full of demons, was not to be trusted. If someone offered you a bucket of fresh rainwater, you had two options: bless it or run. Yet, despite all of this, there was a consistent desire to stay ritually clean. Even if the concept of microbes hadn't been invented yet, people sensed that filth wasn't ideal. That's why so many turned to dry perfumes, powders, and fumigations. Think of it as medieval Febreze. Individuals burned aromatic herbs under their garments, trying to fumigate their own bodies like little walking smokehouses. Rosemary, sage, and thyme were popular choices, not just because they smelled good, but because people hoped the smoke would ward off both disease and demons. Imagine someone walking through the village in a cloud of burning thyme and muttering prayers, not because they were eccentric, but because they had a date and didn't want to bring the plague along. Children weren't spared these practices. Babies were often swaddled so tightly they couldn't move, under the belief that straight limbs made for a virtuous adult. Bathing a baby was rare, and when it happened, wine or vinegar might be used instead of water, just in case a demon had taken residence in the folds of their neck. It's a miracle any child survived long enough to grow crooked in the first place, and when all else failed, people prayed, not just with words, but with actions, such as crawling to a shrine on their knees, fasting until they fainted, or giving up something precious to bargain with heaven. Sometimes what they gave up was cleanliness itself. There are recorded cases of saints who refused to bathe for decades as acts of piety. One nun reportedly lived 40 years without touching water. Her fellow sisters didn't argue, either out of reverence or because by year 20 they'd lost their sense of smell entirely. The more you peel back the layers of medieval life, the more it becomes clear. People weren't foolish. They were just deeply committed to ideas we now find strange. But isn't that the essence of history? A mirror that reflects not just where we came from, but what we still cling to without realizing it. The rituals change, but the longing for safety, health, and meaning, that stays. It's a strange thing to realize that in the Middle Ages, your best shot at surviving illness wasn't a doctor. It was your neighbor's pig bladder hanging on the door. This wasn't a culinary statement. People genuinely believed that certain objects, especially organs from animals, could absorb sickness like some kind of biological sponge. If you were feeling under the weather, you didn't reach for tea or rest. You strung up a sheep's lung above your bed and hoped for divine osmosis. The pig bladder, in particular, became a sort of medieval thermometer. If it turned black or shriveled in a certain way, that was taken as proof of success. The disease had been pulled out of your body. It's as if someone looked at a rotting organ and thought, perfect, it's working. Somewhere in the middle of this was probably a medieval version of a hypochondriac, someone who kept a drawer full of goat kidneys, just in case they caught a cough. Of course, the boundaries between medicine, magic, and household chores were more or less non-existent. Brewing beer, for instance, was both a survival skill and a spiritual act. Water was often too contaminated to drink, so beer became the safer option. Yes, you heard that right. Children drank beer daily because it was more trustworthy than the village well. Imagine an 8-year-old today showing up to school with a packed lunch and a pint of lager, explaining to the teacher, "It's for my health." Then there were amulets, which could be made of anything from gemstones to bones to the fingernail of a dead priest. And yes, that was a real one. These were stitched into clothing, hung around the neck, or hidden in shoes. One of the most prized charms was a dried toad sewn into a pouch and worn under the left armpit to cure fevers. The logic being that if you were willing to walk around smelling like pond death, you deserved to be healed. Sometimes medieval cures felt less like medicine and more like a dare. Washing clothes was also a ritual of its own. Not necessarily for cleanliness, mind you, but for resetting the spiritual energy of a garment. People believed that sins could cling to fabric, especially undergarments. It wasn't enough to wash the body. You had to cleanse the guilt from your shirt. Some monasteries had entire ceremonies dedicated to laundering robes, complete with chants. Laundry day wasn't just a task. It was an exorcism with soap. Not surprisingly, clothing itself became a tool for spiritual protection. People stitched prayers into their sleeves, wore charms in their hats, and even hid sacred texts in their boots. There's something oddly relatable about that, if you think about it. Today, we wear fitness trackers and crystals. Back then, it was a splinter of the true cross sewn into your underwear. Fashion with function, just a different kind of data tracking. But some rituals went far beyond protection and ventured straight into performance. A woman hoping to conceive might bake a loaf of bread shaped like a baby, bless it, and bury it beneath her marital bed. It sounds bizarre until you realize it's not so different from modern fertility bracelets or those oddly specific Instagram ads that show up after you Google baby names once. The instinct hasn't changed, just the packaging. Even death, perhaps especially death, came with its own rituals that blurred the lines between medical and magical. A dying person was often positioned facing east so their soul would rise with the sun. Mirrors were covered to prevent the soul from getting trapped in its own reflection, and clocks were stopped, not out of symbolism, but to stop time from dragging the soul back. It was as if the entire house had to pretend time didn't exist, just to let someone pass on in peace. Funerals were community events, but not necessarily solemn ones. In many villages, professional mourners were hired to wail dramatically, not just to express grief, but to confuse evil spirits who might be listening. Loud crying, it was believed, scared demons away. Which means the louder your aunt cried, the more likely your soul reached heaven. Never underestimate the power of emotionally weaponized relatives. But perhaps the most bewildering custom was the sin eater, A real person, often poor and ostracized, who would come to a funeral and literally eat bread and drink ale over the deceased's body. This symbolic meal was thought to absorb the person's sins, allowing them to enter the afterlife clean. In essence, one man's spiritual detox was another man's lunch. You got paid a few coins and, in return, carried someone else's eternal guilt, which, if we're honest, isn't all that different from being in customer service. And still, through all this, through the amulets and bladders and screaming funerals, there was a kind of coherence. These rituals may seem ridiculous now, but they were deeply human attempts to create order in a world where chaos was the default. Disease came without warning, weather could wipe out a harvest, and half your neighbors were probably either sick, possessed, or both. In that reality, the pig bladder wasn't irrational. It was hope with a pulse. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh at how earnestly people clung to these beliefs. But consider this. Hundreds of years from now, someone might do the same with us. They'll chuckle at our juice cleanses, our Bluetooth sleep masks, our corporate team-building retreats. Ah, yes, they'll say. In the 21st century, humans believed their stress could be cured by screaming into a pillow or eating kale, and they won't be entirely wrong. So maybe it's not the rituals that are strange, but the lengths to which we'll go to feel like we're in control. Whether it's burying a bread baby under your bed or buying a digital meditation app, the goal is the same: to protect ourselves from the randomness of life, to find meaning in the mess, and to cling, however humorously, to the illusion that we're doing something about it. There's something undeniably human about staring into the unknown and deciding the best way to respond is by lighting something on fire. Whether it was to cleanse a house of disease or to drive out spirits that definitely didn't pay rent, fire became the medieval answer to just about every invisible problem. Your child has a fever? Burn rosemary under the bed? Bad dreams? Throw herbs into the hearth and whisper a prayer while facing east? Mysterious noises in the attic? Light a candle and hope it doesn't burn the whole house down. It was spiritual pest control with a touch of arson. Sometimes they didn't stop at herbs. Entire garments were burned as offerings or as punishment for carrying sin. Clothes could absorb not only disease, but misfortune, curses, or, my personal favorite, moral decay, which is quite the accusation to make against a pair of wool trousers, but that was the logic. Burn the shirt, purge the sin. And maybe that's why modern humans still enjoy the symbolic power of bonfires. Ever wondered why burning old love letters feels satisfying? We might just be channeling our inner 13th century monk. And if you think fire was the most extreme form of purification, wait until you meet cold water. Icy immersion wasn't just for the brave, it was for the guilty, the sick, or sometimes the merely unlucky. Cold water trials were used in legal settings. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, innocent. Yes, the justice system literally said, let's throw them in a lake and see what happens. It was courtroom drama meets water park. People feared the ordeal, but feared what came after even more. Survive, and you're punished. Drown, and you're vindicated. A lose-lose that somehow became institutionalized. Meanwhile, the emotional terrain of life was equally treacherous. Envy, for instance, wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered contagious. A jealous neighbor could curse your crops simply by walking past your field too slowly. There were cases of entire communities banding together to cleanse the soil after someone suspected of envy had been seen glaring at a tomato plant. Protective charms were hung on livestock, not just for wolves, but for the evil eye. And in some villages, people chewed garlic during market days, not for the taste, but to confuse the spirits. Whether it confused anyone else is another matter. This paranoia extended to architecture. Homes were designed with oddly angled windows and zigzag thresholds meant to disorient malicious entities trying to enter. One popular trick was the witch bottle, a container filled with nails, urine, and hair, buried under the floorboards to trap malevolent forces. Imagine renting a charming medieval cottage today and finding a jar of someone's 600-year-old bathroom habits in the kitchen wall. Suddenly, the open floor plan doesn't feel so inviting. And then there were the bells. Bells were considered sacred tools, capable of driving out storms, healing illnesses, and silencing demons. Churches rang them not just for mass, but during childbirth, funerals, even plague outbreaks. It's likely the entire village lived in a state of mild tinnitus. If you were a demon in the 1300s, you couldn't get a moment's peace. Every time you approached a town, some elderly woman with a strong arm and a rope sent a sonic warning through your eardrums. It's no wonder spirits retreated. They probably just wanted a nap. Daily life also included strange contracts with the elements. Rain was seen as both blessing and threat. If the crops needed water, a village might host a procession, parading a relic or a sacred object until the heavens opened. But if it rained too much, that same community might publicly accuse a resident of weather manipulation, especially if they were old, lived alone, or, worst of all, owned a black cat. The line between respected elder and lightning-calling menace was thinner than the village roof that leaked every spring. Superstition didn't stop at weather. Animals were drafted into the spiritual battlefield too. Black dogs were feared, owls were omens of death, And donkeys were somehow considered holy just because they carried the occasional saint. Chickens? Depends on how they looked at you. If one crowed at the wrong hour, it might end up on the dinner table with a side of accusation. But the real MVPs of medieval superstition were cats. Simultaneously worshipped and burned, they were seen as witches' companions, bringers of fertility and familiars of the devil. A single meow at midnight could cancel your marriage plans. Speaking of marriages, love was rarely left to chance. Affection could be influenced by charms, potions, or strategic prayers. One popular ritual involved soaking a piece of bread in wine, whispering the name of your beloved, and feeding it to a dog. If the dog went straight to that person afterward, it was a sign you were destined to be together. If it threw up, well, interpret that as you will. Medieval dating apps were weird, but at least they came with snacks. Even children's games had spiritual dimensions. Hide and seek wasn't just play, it was a symbolic practice mimicking death and rebirth, used during seasonal festivals. Jumping over fires during Midsummer Eve wasn't just for fun, it was a way to cleanse oneself of misfortune. Imagine explaining to a 5-year-old today that hopscotch used to be a mini ritual against demons. Why do we draw boxes? To trap bad energy, Timmy. Now jump! The line between sacred and absurd was thin, constantly shifting and often hilarious. And yet, when you look past the oddness, there's something beautifully human about all of it. A desperate, creative, often comical attempt to survive a world that made no promises. When science was limited and chaos seemed personal, people reached for meaning, however strange the shape it took. And perhaps that's the lesson we carry forward. Our rituals may look different now. Smartwatches instead of bells, therapy instead of toad amulets, but the impulse is the same. We still try to make sense of the mess. We still light metaphorical candles and bury metaphorical jars. We still want to believe that there's a pattern, that there's protection, that there's hope. We may not hang pig bladders on the door anymore. But let's be honest, if someone on TikTok said it cured anxiety, how many people would at least consider it? If you ever wondered what fear looks like in powdered form, just imagine a medieval apothecary offering you a plague cure, made from crushed emeralds, dried vipers, and a dash of powdered mummy. Yes, real mummies. Imported, ground up, and sold like mystical aspirin. It sounds ridiculous now, but to a terrified society where death roamed in cloaks and carts, any substance that sounded ancient or rare must have seemed like bottled wisdom. And if you were rich enough to swallow a pharaoh, why not? At least you'd die expensively. The obsession with ancient things as inherently powerful wasn't limited to mummies. People genuinely believed relics held protective energy. Bones of saints, splinters from crosses, locks of hair preserved in wax. Entire towns were built around the toe of a long-deceased holy man. And the irony? Most of those relics were fake. If all the pieces of the true cross were gathered, we'd have enough wood to build Noah's Ark and maybe a patio set. But no one dared question it. Faith wasn't just spiritual, it was survival logic. If carrying the femur of Saint What's-His-Name gave you peace during a pandemic, who were you to argue? Even recipes were not safe from spiritual expectations. Cookbooks from the period didn't just list ingredients, they told you what phase the moon should be in, which direction to stir, and which prayers to whisper between boiling and simmering. You weren't just making soup, you were conducting an edible ritual. Stir counterclockwise under a waxing crescent, or your broth may turn against you. No pressure. And let's not forget the belief that adding 7 basil leaves and a hair from a virgin's head could turn a stew into a love potion. Which raises the important modern question, who was in charge of the hair? Cemeteries, those quiet places of mourning now filled with neatly arranged stones and the occasional jogger, were once the loudest intersections of life, death, and superstition. People picnicked on graves to commune with ancestors. Children played hide and seek among the tombs. And graveyards were often planted with herbs like rosemary and lavender, not for decoration, but to ward off evil or to mask the, let's say, natural aromas of decay. In some regions, it was custom to leave food on the graves. The dead might not eat, but the cats definitely would, and perhaps that counted for something. If someone sneezed in medieval times, people didn't just say, "bless you," out of politeness. It was an act of spiritual defense. A sneeze was considered a crack in your soul's armor. Some even believed the devil could slip in during that split second. So if someone sneezed 3 times, everyone around would practically form a human circle of prayer. The modern equivalent would be screaming antivirus update every time your laptop freezes. Hair, oddly enough, had an entire superstition ecosystem of its own. Cutting your hair during certain phases of the moon could bring disaster or fortune. Burying hair clippings under the floor could protect you from illness. And giving your hair to a lover? Risky business. They could use it to enchant, bind, or emotionally blackmail you in the astral plane. One medieval breakup might have involved screaming, "Give me back my braid, you warlock." Romance has always been complicated. Windows were another battleground. Some people covered them with fabric soaked in vinegar during storms, not to block wind, but to keep out evil spirits that supposedly rode thunder like it was Uber. Others painted symbols on the glass, believing they acted like spiritual insect repellent. In fact, a surprising number of homes had symbols drawn, etched, or nailed into them, above doors, on ceilings, inside fireplaces. Protection was less about aesthetic and more about defense. It's as if every home doubled as a fortress in a quiet war against the unseen. And if you thought rituals were just for the home, think again. Public spaces had their own share of spiritual choreography. Fountains were blessed. Markets had designated cleansing days when certain goods were not allowed to be sold, lest misfortune attach itself to your carrots. Bridges had protective charms buried in their foundations. Even public wells had guardian spirits, some friendly, others temperamental. If your bucket came up dry, it wasn't just bad plumbing, it was personal. Certain numbers carried weight. 3 was sacred, 4 suspicious, 7 divine, 13 cursed. If you dropped a spoon, it meant a visitor was coming. If you dropped a knife, it meant the visitor was probably angry. And if you broke a mirror, congratulations. You just invited 7 years of misfortune and a village-wide debate about whether it was your fault the crops failed. All of this, of course, makes you wonder, were medieval people simply naive? Or did they just have a more colorful way of interpreting a chaotic world? Maybe both. But here's the thing. Superstition, at its core, is not about being irrational. It's about needing a framework. When life gives you plague, famine, and questionable dentistry, you don't just sit around waiting for logic. You light a candle, bury a charm, sprinkle some salt on your doorstep, and hope the universe gives you a break. And isn't that what we still do, in our own way? We knock on wood, avoid walking under ladders, make wishes on eyelashes. We may not believe our neighbors are witches, but we sure do believe in energy, vibes, the full moon affecting our mood, and blaming Mercury for our problems. The ingredients have changed, but the recipe is eerily familiar. Maybe what the medieval mind teaches us is not how silly humans used to be, but how deeply we crave connection, to each other, to meaning, to the idea that something is watching, guiding, or at least listening. And if all it takes is a whispered prayer, a bundle of herbs, or a painted symbol on the wall to give us that comfort, well, maybe it's not superstition. Maybe it's just storytelling we tell ourselves to feel safer in the dark. And really, if you had to choose between being rational and feeling safe, wouldn't you keep that rabbit's foot just in case? If you ever find yourself whispering to bread before putting it in the oven, congratulations. You might be closer to your medieval ancestors than you think. Back then, baking wasn't just a culinary act, it was a spiritual negotiation. People believed bread could absorb intention, emotion, and sometimes even curses. That's why a housewife in 1422 might murmur a blessing over her dough, not for taste, but to prevent her neighbors from dreaming of frogs for a week. Bread was sustenance, sure, but it was also sacred real estate for superstition. They didn't stop at bread. Milk, eggs, and butter had their own fragile mythologies. Spilling milk wasn't just annoying, it was seen as an omen. Eggs left overnight risked being bewitched, and butter that wouldn't churn was often blamed on a neighbor's evil eye. There were entire court cases about bewitched butter. Picture a medieval judge solemnly asking, "Did your butter curdle on its own, or was Goody Agnes glaring at it again?" It sounds absurd now, but when your survival depended on food, any anomaly needed a scapegoat, preferably one with a mole and a suspicious cat. Speaking of cats, they were both feared and revered. In some places, a black cat crossing your path meant doom. In others, it meant fortune. It was all location-based, like medieval Yelp reviews. But more than that, cats became entangled in the spiritual tug-of-war between good and evil. Some believed they were witches in disguise. Others saw them as protectors against evil spirits. Either way, they were never just pets. They were furry question marks prowling across belief systems, occasionally knocking over candles and accidentally summoning something. Animals in general held strange symbolic power. Owls were feared as omens of death. Frogs were associated with plagues. Snakes were either demonic or divine, depending on how poetic your local priest was feeling that week. Even pigs had their superstitions. Some said they could see ghosts. Now imagine going to feed your pig, and it suddenly freezes and stares into the corner of the barn like it's watching a Netflix horror series. You drop your slop bucket and move into town. Mirrors, much like today, were sources of vanity but also of anxiety. They were considered dangerous objects, capable of reflecting not just your face, but your soul, your fate, and sometimes your future. Breaking a mirror was seen as a serious cosmic offense. In some cases, people even covered mirrors during storms to prevent lightning from jumping through the glass. Yes, you read that right. Lightning had teleportation privileges if you didn't respect the rules. Imagine explaining that to your landlord after a burnt wall. No, it wasn't the wiring. The lightning came through the mirror. Obviously. Dreams were another realm of deep superstition. If you dreamed of teeth falling out, it meant a death in the family. If you dreamed of water, it foretold emotional upheaval. If you dreamed of flying, it meant your soul was trying to escape your body, which, frankly, sounds like the most accurate explanation for some nightmares. People kept dream diaries, not as therapy, but as diagnostic tools. Your subconscious was a battlefield of messages, warnings, and cosmic spam that needed to be sorted every morning with a prayer and possibly a mild exorcism. Colors weren't just fashion choices, they were signals. Wearing too much black outside of mourning could raise suspicion. Green was sometimes linked to mischief and fairies, who were not the cute, glittery creatures we imagine today, but more like unpredictable spirits who might steal your child or braid your horse's mane into knots just to confuse you. And red. Red was power, love, or danger. Basically every Taylor Swift album in one pigment. Even numbers had personalities. 3 was holy, 7 was perfect, 9 was magical, 12 was sacred. But some numbers, like 6 or 13, carried dark connotations. People would rearrange wedding dates to avoid unlucky numbers, or count sheep backward to ward off evil, which, honestly, just sounds like poor sleep hygiene. And if a baby was born on a particularly unlucky date, some families would pretend it was born a day later. Paperwork was easier to manipulate when record-keeping was a guy with a feather and a hangover. Seasons, of course, ruled everything. Winter was a time of spiritual vulnerability, cold, darkness, the thinning of the veil. Spring brought renewal, but also the fear of hidden curses thawing alongside the soil. Summer was strength, yet ripe with heat-induced madness. And autumn? That's when things got weird. Harvest festivals weren't just celebrations, they were protection rituals in disguise. If the crops came in well, it meant the spirits were pleased. If not, it might be time to dig up the doll someone buried last year behind the barn just in case. Wells and water sources were treated with eerie respect. Some were said to grant wishes, others demanded offerings. And woe to the fool who disrespected a well spirit. It might dry up, or worse, talk back. Folktales told of entire families cursed for drawing water on the wrong day. Modern plumbing has taken the mystery out of water, but wouldn't it be more fun if your faucet whispered riddles once in a while? What ties all of this together is a strange kind of poetic logic. In a world with no modern science, superstition was a map, imperfect, often wild, but deeply human. It gave meaning to randomness. It made people feel less powerless, and honestly, sometimes it made more sense than reality. If your cow died and your neighbor's eyebrows looked suspiciously arched, well, case closed. Who needs forensics when you have gossip and garlic? Maybe that's why, even today, we love a little mystery. We light candles for intentions, throw coins into fountains, knock on wood, avoid certain hotel room numbers. We want the world to feel a little magical, a little less random, a little more like a place where meaning hides behind every creak in the floorboards or flicker of the lights. And let's be real. If your phone falls face down on the floor and doesn't crack, and you whisper thank you under your breath, you're not being silly. You're just honoring a tradition that goes back centuries, one shaky miracle at a time. They say that silence is golden, but in a medieval village, silence could mean a dozen different things, none of them peaceful. A quiet room might have meant someone was praying or plotting. A quiet neighbor? Definitely a witch. A quiet child? Probably possessed. In fact, too much silence could rattle the nerves more than a thunderclap. People wanted noise, but the right kind of noise. Bells chiming, chickens clucking, fires crackling, drunk men arguing over nothing. It was the music of life. When that music stopped, the imagination filled the gap. And let's be honest, the imagination of a 14th century farmer could rival Stephen King on a deadline. Take, for instance, the wind. Today, it's just wind. But back then, the wind carried messages, omens, even curses. A gust through the churchyard might mean the dead were whispering. A strong breeze at night, someone had angered the spirits. And if your candle flickered during a story, that wasn't bad air circulation. That was confirmation the story was true. Ghosts were listening and possibly critiquing your delivery. It wasn't enough to survive the weather. You had to read it like a warning label from the gods. But not all fear came from the sky. Some of it lived right in your pantry. Salt, for example, was a weapon against evil, not metaphorically, literally. People sprinkled salt across thresholds to prevent demons from entering, as if Beelzebub would come knocking but politely stop at the seasoning. Bread baked without salt? Suspicious. A spilled salt jar? A spiritual emergency. That's where the over-the-shoulder toss began. Not just to undo the bad luck, but to metaphorically blind whatever spirit might be lurking behind you, waiting to pounce. Nothing like a dash of salt to the eyes of a demon to say, "Not today, Satan." Herbs, too, were multitaskers. Sage for cleansing, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for sleep, and sometimes seduction. And then there was mugwort, the overachiever of the plant kingdom, used in cooking, healing, protection, and dream magic. It was like the Swiss Army knife of medieval mysticism. A woman with a bunch of mugwort tucked into her apron could be a healer, a midwife, or a heretic, depending on the mood of the village. Same woman, same herb, different trial outcome. Speaking of herbs and trials, let's talk about love potions. Because no matter the century, people have always been willing to risk a little poison for the chance at affection. Recipes included everything from rose petals and honey to bodily fluids. Yes, you heard that correctly. Some effective love spells involved items we shall not name over dinner. But back then, if you couldn't get someone to notice you with a smile and a good stew, there was always pig fat, hair clippings, and incantations whispered into the moonlight. Romantic? Not exactly. Desperate? Definitely. But hey, swipe left hadn't been invented yet. Weddings were no less bizarre. Forget matching napkins. People were more concerned with charms to keep the groom from fleeing and the bride from being swapped by fairies. There were superstitions about the color of the dress, the direction of the wind, the way the chickens clucked that morning. A sneeze during the ceremony? Bad luck. Unless it was from a priest, then it meant fertility. Don't try to apply logic here, you'll hurt yourself. Once married, the real spiritual negotiations began. Protection rituals for the bed, amulets under pillows, prayers to ensure conception, and sometimes, yes, burning your spouse's toenail clippings to prevent infidelity. Let that image settle in. You might be thinking, surely not, but people in the 1300s weren't playing. Love was sacred, messy, and protected with every tool available, including superstition, wool dolls, and mysterious powders. And what about childbirth? That was a cosmic event layered in ritual. Midwives were revered, feared, and sometimes accused of witchcraft if things went wrong. Every part of the process was spiritual. The herbs used, the chants whispered, the clothes worn. Even the cord had to be cut with a specific type of blade at a precise moment, or risk bringing misfortune. If a baby was born with a caul, a piece of the amniotic sac still on their face, it was seen as a mark of psychic ability. Some parents preserved it and sold it to sailors who believed it would prevent drowning. Nothing says maritime confidence like carrying someone else's birth membrane in your pocket. Of course, you couldn't raise a child without worrying about the evil eye. This belief transcended cultures. Too many compliments? The child might fall ill. Too much beauty? Definitely cursed. The solution? Tie a red thread around their wrist, spit near them, yes, spit, or keep a protective charm nearby. Because nothing says, I love you, like hawking a loogie in your newborn's direction. But curses weren't just personal. Whole fields could be cursed. Cows, tools, even looms. If your spinning wheel broke on a full moon, you could assume the fae were displeased. Some people went to priests, others to cunning folk, wise women and men who knew the secrets of herbs, bones, and whispered Latin that may or may not have been real. These healers walked a delicate line, respected on Monday, burned by Friday. Their crime? Knowing too much about things you couldn't explain. And yet, despite the fear, there was awe. There was beauty in believing that everything had a spirit, that water remembered, that trees listened, that your dead relatives were always nearby, silently judging your baking. It gave life depth, texture, and meaning. Sure, it also made every creaky floorboard a potential haunting, but honestly, some of us still feel a chill when the lights flicker for no reason, which brings us to a final curiosity. How much of this we've really left behind? We may scoff at the idea of a cursed potato, but we still make wishes on candles, knock on wood, avoid walking under ladders, and don't say Macbeth out loud in theaters. Why? Because deep down, we still hunger for mystery. We crave a universe that listens, that hints, that warns. We want to believe that the ordinary is just a disguise for something extraordinary. So next time your toast lands butter side up, take a moment. Maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe your ancestors are applauding from beyond the veil, whispering, finally, they got something right. There's something hilariously human about the fact that for centuries, people believed sneezes were tiny soul escapes. A single aku was a spiritual emergency. Blink, and your essence might slip right out of your nostrils. That's why people said, bless you, not as a polite reaction, but as a kind of spiritual seatbelt. The idea was that for one brief moment, your body was defenseless, your soul adrift like laundry in a hurricane, and the only thing tethering you back to your flesh prison was the good vibes of whoever happened to be standing nearby. But sneezes weren't the only bodily function to stir superstition. Hiccups? Someone was talking about you. Yawns? Your soul was trying to escape out of boredom. And if your ear was ringing, the spirits were gossiping. It seems the body was less a machine and more a Morse code of omens. Every twitch, every shiver, every stomach gurgle carried meaning. Imagine trying to digest a meal and wondering if the bubbling in your belly was indigestion or a warning from the beyond. Even your dreams were suspect. Modern psychologists call it subconscious processing, but in the medieval mind, dreams were telegrams from heaven or hell. Dream of a fish? That meant pregnancy. Dream of falling? You were about to sin. Dream of teeth falling out? That was death. To be fair, we still Google that one at 3 a.m., so maybe they were onto something. There were entire books decoding dreams with meaning shifting based on the day of the week, the phase of the moon, and whether or not you'd eaten cheese before bed. Spoiler, it was almost always the cheese. And then there was the moon, glorious, glowing, and deeply untrustworthy. Full moons were for madness. New moons were for rituals. If your baby was born under a waxing crescent, they might grow up clever but deceitful. A waning gibbous? kind, but doomed to heartbreak. Lunar influence was the medieval version of a personality test. Today, we have Myers-Briggs. Back then, you just looked up. The sky didn't just reflect your fate, it was your fate. But if the moon was a mirror of destiny, the stars were its scribes. Astrology was serious business. Kings had court astrologers. Peasants consulted star charts before planting potatoes. Every movement of the heavens was a nudge, a whisper, a warning. Saturn inching too close to Mars? Time to cancel your pilgrimage. Venus rising in Aries? Love was coming, and probably with consequences. It's easy to laugh now, but consider this. How many people today refuse to date a Scorpio? Even clothing had hidden meanings. Wearing your shirt inside out by accident was considered protection against curses. Turning your cloak at a crossroads could confuse a lurking spirit. Wearing green on a Thursday might attract fairies. And you didn't want that. Not the cute kind with wings, but the old ones who kidnapped children and left changelings in their place. A fairy encounter wasn't a Disney moment. It was an interdimensional identity theft. Speaking of changelings, the fear of having your baby swapped was so pervasive that parents developed rituals, songs, even iron charms placed near cradles to keep the fair folk away. One way to check if your baby was still your baby, try to surprise them with music or odd behavior. If the child didn't react, it might be a changeling, or just deeply unimpressed. Either way, time to call the local wise woman. Wise women were the backbone of spiritual survival. Not witches, at least not until the authorities said so. They were healers, midwives, matchmakers, grief counselors, and sometimes accidental therapists. You didn't book an appointment, you brought a chicken or a sack of herbs, or simply your desperation. These women knew which root to boil, which prayer to mutter, which feather to place under your pillow. Their medicine was a mix of botany, instinct, and inherited whispers. They walked between worlds, and they did it in woolen skirts with pockets full of secrets. And while wise women healed the living, the dead were never far away. Graveyards were not just final destinations. They were part of everyday life. People picnicked there, prayed there, slept there if necessary. Bones were sometimes repurposed. Skulls became warning signs. Teeth were used in potions. The veil between life and death was tissue thin, and nobody trusted it to stay closed for long. It wasn't morbid. It was pragmatic. Death was constant, and sometimes it left gifts behind. One of the strangest of these gifts was the belief in corpse candles, mysterious floating lights seen in graveyards or on lonely roads. These flickers were thought to be spirits guiding the way to their own burial, or warning of a death yet to come. Today, we might call it swamp gas. Back then, it was a glowing RSVP from the afterlife. Even animals weren't exempt from suspicion. Cats, especially black ones, were simultaneously loved and feared. They were said to carry souls, to walk between worlds. If your cat stared at a wall for too long, it wasn't zoning out. It was seeing something you couldn't. And don't even get started on owls. Hearing one hoot at night, a death omen, seeing one in daylight, a rift in the natural order. Still adorable, but potentially cursed. Of course, none of these beliefs existed in a vacuum. They were woven into the fabric of daily survival, a way of making sense of the inexplicable. When medicine failed, when logic faltered, when crops died or children cried or rain refused to fall, people turned to the invisible, to meaning, to magic. And isn't that still what we do? Only now we call it manifesting or energy work or trusting the universe. Same yearning, different vocabulary. And maybe that's the most haunting truth of all. We haven't changed that much. We still knock on wood. Avoid the number 13. Wish on stars. We still believe in signs. Only now they arrive via algorithms instead of omens. We read horoscopes with half a smile but a full heart. We feel something when the lights flicker, when the dog growls at nothing, when the wind whispers our name. So if tonight as you fall asleep the floor creaks or the air shifts or a shadow seems a little too still, don't panic, just smile. Someone or something might just be checking in. After all, the boundary between now and then, real and imagined, is thinner than we think. And if that's not comforting, well, maybe it should be. Somewhere in the middle of the night, a spoon fell in a kitchen and someone half asleep in bed whispered, "That's a bad omen." Not because they genuinely believed it, but because generations before them had whispered the same thing. A spoon falling meant unexpected visitors. A knife falling meant conflict. A fork? Well, probably just gravity. But superstitions cling to the human psyche like stubborn cobwebs in old attics. Even when we don't believe them, we behave as if we might, just in case. And just in case has always been the unofficial slogan of humanity. Why else would sailors tattoo roosters and pigs on their feet? Not because they liked barnyard chic, but because those animals were thought to survive shipwrecks. They floated in wooden crates and were considered lucky omens at sea. Imagine explaining that to a modern tattoo artist. Yes, I'd like a pig on my foot for buoyancy, but fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears a soft cloak of rituals, like knocking 3 times before entering a new room, or holding your breath when you pass a cemetery so spirits don't slip inside. As if ghosts were sitting on headstones like Uber drivers waiting for a ride. And yet, we do it. We hold that breath, just in case. Even thresholds were sacred. You never handed something directly through a doorway. It invited bad luck. Step inside first, then pass the sugar. Or the dagger, depending on the century. The doorway wasn't just an architectural feature, it was a portal, a space between spaces where energies could shift and cling. That's why people used to hang iron horseshoes above them, or dried herbs, or dolls made of straw. If your Airbnb ever smells like lavender and regret, now you know why. And it wasn't just buildings. Bridges were liminal too. Dangerous, magical places. Trolls lived under them, riddles waited upon them, and lovers threw coins from them. Coins, always coins. A payment, an offering, a bribe to the universe. Toss one into a fountain, and suddenly you're in a contract with fate. People still do it, every day, in every city, without question. Wishing, hoping, bargaining, like slot machines that only pay out in dreams. Then there were mirrors, which to this day we don't entirely trust. Break one, and you're cursed with 7 years of bad luck. Why 7? Who knows? Maybe because 5 seemed too short and 10 felt like overkill. But the fear stuck. Mirrors were seen as soul traps, reflections as glimpses into parallel worlds. That's why covering mirrors during mourning was common. It kept the soul of the deceased from getting confused or, worse, getting stuck. Imagine dying and then spending eternity trapped in the bathroom mirror, watching people do skincare routines with existential dread. But death, ever the quiet guest, didn't only haunt glass. It lingered in clocks. If one stopped unexpectedly, it was said someone had just died, or would soon. That's why, in some traditions, clocks were stopped the moment someone passed away, so time would not mock the silence with its ticking. It wasn't superstition. It was reverence. A way to say, even time pauses for grief. Speaking of which, the idea of time itself wasn't always so straightforward. Some cultures believed that certain hours of the day were more spiritually vulnerable. The witching hour, around 3 a.m., was thought to be the time when the veil between worlds was thinnest. That's why your brain wakes you up then with deeply philosophical thoughts like, did I leave the stove on? Or what if the universe is just a simulation? Or what if I am the spoon? This fear of the invisible bled into architecture. Have you ever wondered why so many old staircases creak at exactly the same step? It's not just age, it's design. Some stair builders intentionally left one stair uneven to confuse evil spirits. Yes, really. Apparently, malevolent entities are easily startled by surprise carpentry, which, honestly, is relatable. Even colors weren't neutral. In medieval Europe, yellow meant betrayal. Blue was divine. Red was power and blood. White could symbolize purity or death depending on context. Which makes you realize how much thought went into what people wore to weddings or executions, and sometimes both. Letters and numbers, too, carried mystical weight. The number 13, of course, has a long-standing PR problem. Many buildings skip it entirely. Floors jump from 12 to 14 as if math is just a suggestion. Meanwhile, in some Eastern cultures, it's the number 4 that's feared. It sounds too close to the word for death. Hotels avoid it. Elevators skip it. And yet, we still line up to buy lottery tickets full of these numbers, hoping the same symbols that supposedly bring doom might also bring a jackpot. Humans are nothing if not optimistic gamblers in life's cosmic casino. And have you ever noticed how silence makes us nervous? In ancient times, silence wasn't peaceful. It was a warning. If the bird stopped chirping, something was wrong. That instinct remains. If your phone doesn't ping, you assume everyone hates you. If your partner goes quiet, your brain spirals into an Emmy-winning drama. Silence, for all its serenity, carries tension. It begs to be filled with music, with noise, with meaning. So we invented bells. Bells to ring when the wind changed. Bells for weddings, for death, for sheep, for witches. Bells to chase away evil, to mark time, to punctuate emotion. The sound of a bell was like shouting across dimensions. A declaration, I am here, I exist, please don't haunt me. All of this we wrapped around ourselves like invisible armor. Rituals, symbols, gestures, small acts of meaning against a backdrop of uncertainty. Even laughter, that loud, odd human noise, was sometimes used to scare away demons, which might explain why we laugh at funerals and hospitals during breakups, because somewhere deep down, we hope it protects us. So maybe the next time you spill salt, you'll toss a pinch over your left shoulder, not because you believe in devils, but because you believe in humans. In our messy, beautiful habit of trying to make sense of the world, one weird little superstition at a time.